Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
This happened many years ago, back when I was in my 20s. These days I'm in my 60s, and I've told this story more times than I can count. Around here, especially in this part of West Virginia, a lot of people still remember hearing about it. Before I get into what happened, though, there's a little context you need. I've spent my entire life in this part of the country, not far from the Canadian border, and for most of my adult years, I made a living doing something that, at the time, was fairly unusual. Nowadays, you see people house-sitting all the time, and they don't just watch over homes anymore. They'll look after dogs, cats, and just about anything else. Back then, however, hardly anyone was willing to do what I did. My job was simple, in theory. Whenever people traveled and didn't want to leave their property unattended, I'd stay there until they returned. The difference was that I almost always accepted jobs in remote places, where the nearest neighbors were miles away and silence settled in before sunset. I was never reckless. Quite the opposite, actually. I had a habit of thinking everything through, paying attention to details, and turning down anything that didn't feel right. Still, I was young, healthy, and confident enough to believe I could handle more than I probably should have. Looking back, I can admit there was always a balance between caution and necessity, and every now and then, necessity won. At the time, I desperately needed money, and the family offering this particular job was paying far better than anyone else. That alone should have made me wonder why. Instead, I convinced myself it was simply good luck. If I'm being honest, I probably ignored a few warning signs before I had even arrived. To keep this from taking up too much of your time, there are parts I can't remember with complete certainty. Everything that followed unfolded over the course of 3 weeks, and some of the earliest moments have become blurred together over the years. I think I reached the property late in the afternoon. The house sat beside a long, nearly empty road, surrounded by woods that stretched farther than the eye could see. What stood out immediately was that there were only 2 houses close together. Every other home in the area was at least 15 minutes away by car. The owners explained that the neighboring house belonged to the wife's sister. According to them, the sister, her husband, and their 12-year-old daughter all lived there. They made one thing very clear before they left. The family next door valued their privacy, disliked being disturbed, and wanted absolutely nothing to do with anyone outside their own home. My responsibility, they said, was simply to look after the property I had been hired to watch. I'll admit, I found that arrangement a little strange. If someone in your immediate family lives only a few yards away, why would you pay a complete stranger to watch your house instead of asking them? It didn't seem to make much sense. Then again, one lesson I've learned after decades of working inside other people's homes is that you never truly know what exists behind someone else's front door. Families carry histories no outsider can see. People stay close for reasons that have nothing to do with affection. They may share property without sharing trust. For all I knew, they simply tolerated one another. I decided it wasn't my place to ask questions, so I accepted the explanation and focused on the work I had been hired to do. The job itself wasn't difficult, although one detail bothered me more than I expected. I've always preferred complete isolation over being isolated near people I don't know. It probably sounds odd unless you've experienced it yourself, but even now, in my 60s, I would rather be entirely alone in the middle of nowhere than spend days cut off from the world with strangers living only a few steps away. Of course, that's different if the people are friends or family. This situation wasn't. For some reason, knowing another household was so close while remaining completely unreachable made me far more uneasy than genuine solitude ever had. The first 2 nights passed without anything unusual happening. Before long, I noticed that the neighboring family seemed incredibly reclusive. Their curtains stayed closed almost constantly, and the house looked permanently sealed off from the outside world. Even from where I was staying, I could see heavy condensation covering many of the windows, as though fresh air rarely entered the building. Their behavior during our brief conversation before they left had already struck me as somewhat unusual, but I tried not to judge them. This was long before the internet connected everyone. People living in remote areas often kept to themselves, and social expectations weren't quite what they are today. If someone preferred privacy, most people simply accepted it. The only thing that genuinely bothered me was the stale atmosphere inside the house I was watching. Every morning I opened every window, pulled up every blind, and let the air move freely through the rooms until evening. I think everything truly changed on the 3rd day. I happened to glance toward the neighboring house and noticed that every blind was drawn except for a single upstairs window. Standing there, perfectly still, was a young girl. Until that moment, I hadn't seen anyone enter or leave the house. The instant our eyes met, a chill ran through me so suddenly that I can still remember it today. I know that sounds dramatic, but I can't describe it any other way. There was a sadness in her expression that simply didn't belong on a child. Kids are supposed to be energetic, curious, full of life. She looked like someone carrying a weight no 12-year-old should ever have to bear. Even now, after everything I eventually learned, remembering her face still hurts. I stood there for a few moments watching her. Eventually, I raised my hand and gave a small wave, hoping to reassure her that I wasn't a threat. She didn't wave back. She didn't smile. She didn't even move. After a while, I shrugged it off, told myself she was probably shy, and returned to whatever I had been doing. As far as I knew, she lived there with both of her parents, so there wasn't much reason for me to think anything was seriously wrong. Over the following days, I began seeing her more often, although never for very long. I'd look out the window, and there she'd be, standing in exactly the same place. Sometimes she raised one hand in a slow, almost hesitant wave. The more closely I watched, the more unsettling the details became. Whenever I found an excuse to move closer to the windows and look more carefully, she appeared unbelievably thin. The shape of her face seemed almost entirely defined by bone. Her eyes looked deeply sunken, as though there wasn't enough flesh around them anymore. She didn't simply look skinny, she looked sick. Every passing day left me feeling more uncomfortable, especially because I never saw another person anywhere around that house. Eventually, I found myself paying attention to it almost constantly. No one ever stepped outside. No lights caught my attention after dark. The blinds remained closed every hour of every day. Then one night, I couldn't sleep at all. Every so often, I'd get out of bed and glance through the window toward the neighboring house. Every so often, she'd appear again, standing silently behind that same upstairs window. She wore the exact same white dress every single time. She never smiled. She never moved away until I looked somewhere else. By dawn, my nerves were completely shot. I couldn't explain why seeing her affected me so deeply, but something about the whole situation felt profoundly wrong. Before the sun had fully risen, I made up my mind. The following morning, I was going over there. I didn't have much of a plan. All I knew was that I needed to meet her parents, look them in the eye, and understand what kind of people they were. So I walked across to the neighboring house and knocked on the front door. Once, then again, then a third time. Nobody answered. Considering they supposedly knew I was staying next door, I couldn't help thinking they had heard me. If they chose not to open the door, then I clearly wasn't welcome. There wasn't much else I could do, so I walked back to the house, feeling even more unsettled than before. During the days that followed, I kept checking the upstairs window, expecting to see the little girl again. Instead, she vanished completely. Morning after morning, afternoon after afternoon, there was nothing. Somehow, her absence disturbed me even more than her silent presence ever had. I had no idea what was happening inside that house, but by then I needed answers. The uncertainty was becoming unbearable, and for the first time since arriving, I could feel genuine desperation beginning to take hold. It finally reached the point where I couldn't take it anymore. The days kept passing, and then, at last, she appeared again. I remember it perfectly. It was probably around 11:30 at night. I know it wasn't midnight yet, but it was already pitch black outside. I was standing by the window again, trapped in what had become an almost obsessive routine, staring across at that house and trying to make sense of something that simply refused to make sense. By then, I wasn't even expecting answers anymore. I was just hoping to see her again, hoping that maybe this time I would understand what was happening. Then, without warning, she stepped back into that upstairs window. The moment I saw her, every hair on my body stood up. She looked far worse than she ever had before. Even from that distance, I could tell something had changed. Her face looked thinner. Her skin seemed almost gray in the moonlight. She barely had the strength to hold herself upright. Then, for the very first time since I had arrived, I saw her lips move. Up until that moment, she had never shown the slightest expression. She had never smiled, never frowned, never waved, never acknowledged that I was even there. This time, though, she mouthed what looked unmistakably like one word: help. I didn't hesitate for a second. There was no chance I was walking into that house by myself. Anyone who has lived in remote parts of Appalachia knows there are people out there who can become incredibly violent if they think you're interfering in their lives. And I wasn't about to put myself in that position alone. Instead, I called two close friends of mine. They lived roughly 45 minutes away, and I told them I believed a little girl was being held against her will. Neither of them questioned me. They simply got in their trucks and came as fast as they could. Once they arrived, the three of us walked straight over to the neighboring house. We knocked several times. We yelled to see if anyone was inside. There wasn't a sound. The entire place was silent. Finally, convinced that we were dealing with an emergency, we broke one of the first-floor windows and climbed inside. The smell hit us immediately. To this day, I have never experienced anything like it again. It wasn't just the smell of a house that had been closed up for too long. It was something much worse. Dampness, decay, mold, human waste, spoiled food, and stale air had all blended together into something so overwhelming that every instinct in my body told me to turn around and leave. The house was almost completely dark. Most of the curtains had been nailed shut from the inside, and hardly any natural light made its way through. Every room felt abandoned, yet somehow lived in at the same time. We searched downstairs first, calling out for the little girl, checking every room, every closet, every hallway, but there was nobody there. As more time passed without finding her, I started questioning my own sanity. I have never been someone who believes in ghosts or anything supernatural, but standing inside that house, I honestly couldn't come up with another explanation. Either I had imagined everything over the previous days, or I had somehow been staring at something that simply wasn't there. Yet one fact kept pulling me back to reality. The couple who had hired me had specifically told me that the woman's sister lived in that house with her family, and that they didn't like being disturbed. They had made a point of telling me to leave them alone. Looking back, I realized that wasn't casual advice. They wanted me to stay away from that house for a reason. Eventually, we did something people in those mountains almost never do unless there's absolutely no other choice. We called the police. It took them close to 2 hours to search the entire property thoroughly. By then, several deputies had arrived, along with investigators, and they began opening areas of the house we hadn't even realized existed. Hidden behind what looked like an ordinary storage room was a concealed section of the basement. That was where they found her. The truth didn't become public until years later. The family responsible for what had happened was incredibly wealthy, and the man had strong political connections at the state level. From everything I later learned, there was a tremendous amount of pressure behind the scenes to keep the investigation out of the public eye. Even so, bits and pieces eventually made their way into local newspapers. The little girl was, in fact, their biological daughter. For years, they had kept her locked inside that house, almost completely isolated from the outside world. She survived mostly on canned food. She was severely malnourished. The smell inside the house came from the fact that she had been living in conditions no human being should ever experience. She barely had access to running water. She rarely bathed. The only sunlight that ever reached her came through that upstairs window where I had seen her standing all those days. Every other window had been sealed shut. She had almost no fresh air, almost no direct sunlight, and virtually no contact with another human being outside of the people responsible for imprisoning her. Even now, more than 40 years later, I still can't think about that house without feeling sick. At the time, I was terrified for my own safety. As I said before, that man had powerful connections, and for quite a while, it felt like every possible effort was being made to intimidate me into keeping quiet. I won't go into every detail, but there were phone calls, people showing up asking questions they had no business asking, and more than enough incidents to convince me that speaking publicly wasn't worth risking my life over. It wasn't until years later that I learned he had eventually died of old age. His wife died in prison under circumstances I honestly don't know much about. As for the little girl, I have never been able to find out what became of her. There is virtually nothing about her online. I don't know whether she recovered. I don't know if she was placed with a foster family, adopted by someone else, or whether she ever managed to build anything resembling a normal life. I don't even know if she's still alive. All I know is that this happened when I was in my 20s. I'm in my 60s now, and out of everything I've experienced over the course of my life, nothing has ever stayed with me the way the look on that little girl's face has. Some images simply never leave you, and hers is one I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. It all happened about 5 years ago, and even now, I still don't know what I actually walked into. I've gone back and forth with myself more times than I can count, trying to convince myself that I overreacted, that I misunderstood the situation, or that I let my imagination run wild after spending too much time alone in a remote house. The problem is that every explanation I come up with eventually falls apart because of one detail that simply doesn't fit. There was always something that refused to make sense. I still live in the Appalachian Mountains today, and I don't say that to play into the stereotypes people love throwing around online. Most of the people here are hardworking, kind, and would give you the shirt off their back if you needed it. I've lived here my entire life, and I've met far more genuinely good people than bad ones. But just like anywhere else, there are families that make you uncomfortable the moment you meet them. Families where nothing is obviously wrong, yet every instinct you have keeps whispering that something about them isn't right. That's exactly what happened to me. At the time, I was 24 and trying to make extra money however I could. I worked seasonal construction jobs whenever they were available, picked up landscaping work during the summer, and occasionally did house sitting or pet sitting for people around the county. Word spreads pretty quickly in small mountain towns, so once people know you're reliable, they start recommending you to friends, cousins, neighbors, and eventually complete strangers. That's how I ended up getting a call from a woman I'd never met before. She told me she and her husband were leaving for 2 weeks, that they had 2 boys, 6 and 9 years old, along with 2 large dogs that mostly stayed indoors, and that someone from church had given her my number because I had a good reputation. The money she offered was significantly better than anything I'd been making at the time. Looking back, maybe that should have been my first warning. 2 full weeks watching 2 children, 2 big dogs, and staying overnight in a fairly isolated house for that amount of money felt almost too generous. But I convinced myself they were simply paying well because it was a long commitment. The house sat deep in the mountains, nearly 45 minutes from the nearest grocery store, at the end of a narrow gravel road surrounded by dense forest on every side. It wasn't hidden exactly, but it definitely wasn't somewhere you'd accidentally drive past. Their nearest neighbor lived far enough away that you couldn't even see the other house through the trees. When I pulled into the driveway, the place immediately caught my attention. It wasn't run down or neglected. In fact, it was surprisingly well maintained. Fresh paint, neatly cut grass, flower beds that had clearly been taken care of, and a large wraparound porch that overlooked the valley below. If anything, It looked like the picture-perfect mountain home you'd expect to see in a magazine. The feeling changed the moment I stepped inside. I've spent enough time around people to know that sometimes you can't explain why someone makes you uncomfortable. They just do. The father barely smiled the entire time I was there. He spoke politely enough, answered my questions, showed me where everything was kept, and explained the daily routine. But every sentence sounded rehearsed, almost mechanical. The mother was friendlier on the surface, yet she watched me constantly while I walked through the house, almost as if she were evaluating every movement I made instead of simply introducing me to the place. Even the boys behaved strangely. They weren't loud. They weren't spoiled. They didn't throw tantrums or run around screaming like most kids their age. If anything, they were unusually quiet. They answered questions with one-word responses, rarely looked directly at me, and mostly stared at each other as though they were communicating without speaking. I hate even bringing this part up because I don't want it to sound judgmental, but it crossed my mind more than once while I was there. The parents looked oddly similar to one another. The boys looked almost identical to both of them in ways that were difficult to explain. There were certain facial features, the way they spoke, even the expressions they made, that gave me this uncomfortable impression that the family tree might not have had as many branches as it should have. I have absolutely no proof of that, and maybe I was completely wrong, but it was one of those thoughts that quietly settled into the back of my mind and refused to leave. The children also seemed delayed somehow, not intellectually, because they were perfectly capable of holding conversations when they wanted to. It was more their emotional reactions. They rarely smiled, rarely laughed. They watched everything around them with an intensity that felt unsettling for kids that young. The dogs somehow managed to make the atmosphere even stranger. They were both enormous shepherd mixes, easily over 80 pounds each, but they barely acknowledged me. Most dogs either warm up to you or keep their distance. These two simply stared. They would lie across the room without making a sound, following me with nothing but their eyes whenever I moved. If I stood up, both heads turned. If I walked into another room, they slowly got up and followed without making a single noise. They weren't aggressive. They never growled or barked at me. Somehow, that made it worse. It felt less like I was being watched by pets and more like I was constantly being monitored. Before leaving, the mother spent almost 20 minutes explaining the boys' routine in extraordinary detail. What time they ate breakfast, which cups they preferred, which television shows they were allowed to watch, which lights needed to stay on overnight, which doors always had to remain locked. At first, I appreciated how organized she was, but eventually it became excessive. She emphasized several times that she expected regular phone calls every evening so she could check on the children, and she repeated that they liked knowing exactly how every day had gone. I assumed they were simply protective parents. 2 weeks is a long time to leave your children with someone you've only met once, even if that person came highly recommended. In hindsight, I realized they barely asked me any questions about myself. They didn't seem interested in whether I had experience with kids, or whether I felt comfortable staying there. It was almost as though they had already made up their minds before I ever arrived. After they finally drove away, I stood on the porch watching their SUV disappear down the gravel road until it was completely out of sight. Normally, when parents leave, Kids either get excited because they have a babysitter or upset because mom and dad are gone. These boys did neither. They simply turned around, walked back into the house without saying a word, and went upstairs together. Neither one even waved goodbye. The first day passed quietly enough. We played a couple of board games after lunch, watched cartoons for a while, and I made dinner exactly the way their mother had instructed me to. The boys followed every instruction I gave them without arguing once. But something about the way they behaved continued bothering me. They never played independently. They never fought over toys. They almost never spoke unless I asked them a direct question. Every now and then, I'd catch them whispering to each other while looking at me, only for both of them to stop the second I noticed. I kept telling myself I was overthinking it. Kids are weird sometimes. That's just part of being around children. That evening, I made my first scheduled phone call to their mother. She answered immediately, almost before the phone had finished ringing. Before I even had a chance to explain how the day had gone, she asked whether the younger boy had spilled his milk during breakfast, and whether I'd remembered to wipe it up before one of the dogs licked the floor. My stomach tightened for a second, because that had happened earlier that morning. It wasn't a major mess. It had taken maybe 30 seconds to clean up. I laughed and asked how she'd guessed. She simply said, "Mothers know their children better than anyone," and changed the subject. At the time, I didn't think much of it. Now, I wish I had. From that point on, the phone calls became the part of every day that I dreaded the most. They always happened around the same time every evening, and every single conversation left me feeling a little more unsettled than the one before. It wasn't anything obvious. The mother never outright admitted there were cameras inside the house, and she never accused me of doing anything wrong. Instead, she would casually mention tiny details that there was no reasonable way for her to know unless someone had been watching. One night she asked whether the older boy had finished the puzzle in the living room before dinner. Another evening, she asked whether one of the dogs had finally stopped sleeping in front of the fireplace after following me around all afternoon. The strangest one happened on the fourth day, when she laughed and asked whether I had eventually managed to find the flashlight in the kitchen drawer after the power briefly flickered. I had never mentioned the power outage to anyone. It had lasted less than 30 seconds, and I had quietly searched through 2 drawers before finding the flashlight exactly where she'd described. I remember lowering the phone and staring across the kitchen while she continued talking, wondering whether there was some perfectly innocent explanation I simply hadn't thought of. Maybe one of the boys had called her before I had. Maybe the house had a security system she forgot to mention. Maybe I was reading too much into everything because the place already made me uncomfortable. Every explanation sounded reasonable for about 30 seconds before another question arrived that ruined it. The boys didn't become friendlier as the days passed. If anything, they became stranger. They seemed fascinated by things most children avoided. One afternoon, I walked around to the back of the property after realizing the younger boy had disappeared from the yard. I found him crouched beside a fallen log, completely focused on a rat he'd trapped underneath an old bucket. At first, I thought he was trying to help it, or simply looking at it out of curiosity. But then I noticed the stick in his hand and the pile of small rocks beside him. He looked up at me with the most emotionless expression I'd seen on a child, and calmly explained that they liked seeing how long animals could stay alive after getting hurt. There wasn't any excitement in his voice. He wasn't trying to shock me. He said it with the same tone another kid might use to explain a favorite game. I immediately took the bucket away, let the terrified animal run into the woods, and spent several minutes trying to explain that every living thing deserved compassion, that fear and pain weren't entertainment, and that hurting something smaller simply because you could was wrong. He listened without interrupting, nodded politely, and then asked me whether I thought people deserved the same kindness. Before I could answer, he simply walked back toward the house as though the conversation had never happened. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said. Children repeat things they hear. They learn behavior from the adults around them. I kept asking myself where a 6-year-old could possibly learn to think like that, and every answer my mind came up with made me more uncomfortable than the last. Even the older brother seemed oddly amused whenever those conversations happened. He rarely participated, but he'd quietly watch from across the room with this faint little smile that disappeared the second I looked directly at him. The strange incidents slowly became impossible to ignore. Objects I knew I'd left in one room somehow appeared somewhere else. Doors I distinctly remembered closing would be standing open when I walked past them again. I'd wake up in the morning to find both dogs sitting outside my bedroom door, perfectly still, as though they'd been guarding it all night. Every explanation had an innocent possibility attached to it. The boys could have been moving things. The dogs could have pushed doors open. The old house creaked constantly, and mountain homes settle in ways that produce noises capable of convincing you someone else is inside. I repeated those explanations to myself over and over because they were comforting, and because the alternative was one I wasn't prepared to consider. Around the end of the first week, the older boy made a comment that completely changed the way I viewed the house. We were eating dinner in almost complete silence when he casually asked whether I planned on staying longer than the last babysitter. I laughed and asked what had happened to him. Without changing his expression, he quietly replied that the last babysitter was buried somewhere behind the house, and that his parents had told them not to dig in certain parts of the backyard anymore because it made the dogs curious. The younger brother giggled. The older one didn't. He simply continued eating as though he'd commented on the weather. My entire body went cold. I asked whether he was joking, but he only shrugged and said that grown-ups lied about lots of things. I convinced myself it was exactly that. A child repeating something he'd heard online, or trying to scare the new babysitter. Kids say disturbing things all the time without understanding how they sound. Even so, I barely slept that night. The following afternoon, I heard a loud crash somewhere above me while both boys were outside kicking a soccer ball around the yard. One of the dogs suddenly sprinted toward the upstairs hallway, barking for the first time since I'd arrived. I followed him up the stairs and discovered the attic door hanging open. I was certain I'd never seen it open before. The dog disappeared into the darkness above, and I climbed the ladder after him, expecting to find a raccoon or maybe a loose section of the roof making noise in the wind. Instead, I found the dog standing beside several old cardboard boxes, stacked neatly against the far wall. Most of the boxes were full of ordinary junk: Christmas decorations, old blankets, children's clothes. Then I opened one that immediately made my stomach tighten. Inside were dozens of photographs. Every single picture showed a young man somewhere around my age. Some looked like college students, others looked slightly older. None of them were smiling for the camera. They weren't posing. They had clearly been photographed without knowing it. One was asleep on the living room couch. Another was standing at the kitchen sink washing dishes. One was carrying groceries inside from the driveway. Another showed someone sitting exactly where I'd been sitting every evening while talking to the boys. Every single photograph had been taken from high corners of rooms, impossible angles that immediately made me think of security cameras. As I kept digging through the stack, I realized there wasn't just one person. There were dozens. Different faces, different clothes, different years, judging by hairstyles and the changing furniture around the house. All of them seemed completely unaware they were being watched. I was still flipping through the pictures when my phone rang. It was the mother. She didn't ask how I was doing. She didn't ask about the boys. The very first thing she said was that I needed to leave the attic immediately because that part of the house wasn't for guests. My entire body froze. I slowly looked around the attic, searching for a camera, but I couldn't see anything obvious. I tried asking how she knew where I was. She ignored the question completely and repeated, much more firmly this time, that I wasn't supposed to be up there. Her voice became noticeably louder with every sentence until I suddenly realized something that made every hair on my arm stand up. I wasn't only hearing her through the phone anymore. I was hearing her somewhere inside the house. It took my brain several seconds to process what was happening. The phone was still against my ear, but underneath the electronic echo, I could hear the exact same voice shouting from somewhere below me. The timing wasn't perfectly synchronized. There was a slight delay between what came through the phone and what echoed faintly through the floorboards beneath my feet. She hadn't gone on vacation. She was inside the house. For a moment, I couldn't move. Then I heard another sound. A heavy door slammed shut somewhere below the attic, followed by footsteps that definitely weren't the boys. They were slower, heavier, adult footsteps, more than one set. I dropped every photograph where I stood. The dog suddenly began growling toward the attic ladder. I didn't wait to see who was coming up. I climbed down so fast I nearly fell, sprinted through the hallway, shouted for both boys even though I already knew they weren't inside anymore, and ran straight for the front door. Halfway across the living room, I heard another door open somewhere beneath the house, followed by the unmistakable sound of someone running upstairs. I reached my truck, locked the doors before I'd even caught my breath, and threw the transmission into reverse so hard the tires sprayed gravel across the driveway. As I backed onto the road, I looked once in the rearview mirror. Both parents had just come through the front door. Neither of them looked surprised to see me leaving. They simply stood on the porch watching my truck disappear down the mountain road. I drove straight to the sheriff's office without stopping once. At first, deputies explained that nothing I'd described necessarily amounted to a crime. I'd accepted the job voluntarily. They were private homeowners. Hidden cameras inside someone's own home weren't automatically illegal depending on where they were placed, and while the entire situation sounded disturbing, they needed something more concrete before they could search private property. Then I remembered what the older boy had said during dinner. I repeated his exact words about the previous babysitter, supposedly being buried somewhere in the backyard. That immediately changed the tone of the conversation. Detectives visited the property within the next couple of days, and I later learned they spent hours searching the land. they noticed numerous sections of freshly disturbed soil scattered throughout the backyard, enough that they brought in additional personnel to examine the area more carefully. As far as I was ever told, they never recovered human remains, never announced any arrests, and never contacted me again after taking my full statement. Maybe the children had invented the entire story. Maybe the photographs had an innocent explanation. Maybe there really were security cameras throughout the house that the parents simply never disclosed. And maybe they had spent those 2 weeks hiding in the basement for reasons I'll never understand. None of those explanations answer why anyone would secretly photograph dozens of previous babysitters. Why the children behaved the way they did, or why those parents pretended to be hundreds of miles away while they were apparently inside their own house the entire time. 5 years have passed, and I still think about those 2 boys more often than I'd like to admit. I don't know what kind of home they grew up in after I left. I don't know whether anyone ever looked deeper into that family. What I do know is that I never accepted another live-in babysitting job again. Some paychecks simply aren't worth the questions they leave behind.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I've lived in California my whole life. I grew up there, built my routine there, and for a long time I had this idea that eventually I'd leave, move somewhere quieter, more remote, somewhere that matched my personality a bit better. I've always been pretty introspective, the kind of person who actually enjoys being alone for long stretches of time. The problem is, I learned the hard way, twice actually, that there's a difference between liking isolation and depending on it. Both times I tried to move somewhere truly remote, I ended up realizing the same thing. I need the city, not for the noise or the people, but for the safety of knowing that if something goes wrong, I'm not completely on my own. So over time, I figured out a balance that worked for me. I stayed in the city, kept my job, kept my routine, but every couple of months, whenever I could manage it, I'd disappear for a week into the mountains somewhere. That became my reset. Usually, I'd go to the same place. There was a cabin I knew well, somewhere I trusted, and I'll admit I got a bit possessive over it. Not in a literal sense, but it was mine in the way that matters. I knew the layout, I knew the area, I knew what to expect, and when you're spending time in remote places, that kind of predictability matters more than people think. There are 1,000 things that can go wrong out there, and familiarity takes a bit of that edge off. But this time, that option wasn't available. The owner told me one of the pipes had burst, and since the cabin was technically off-grid, but still had systems for hot water, internet, all the things that make it comfortable, it needed repairs. He said it wouldn't be ready in time. At the time, I took it as some kind of sign, like maybe I should switch things up a bit, go somewhere new, instead of repeating the same trip again. A few years back, I had traveled through the Great Smoky Mountains with a close friend, and I remembered how much I liked that area. The landscape, the atmosphere, the way everything felt just a little more raw and untouched. It's part of the Appalachian Mountains, and something about that region stuck with me. So I figured this was the perfect excuse to go back. I found a cabin online, read through the reviews, everything seemed solid. The owner was easy to talk to, very friendly. Funny enough, he actually lived in the same area of California as I did. At the time, I didn't think much of it, just another coincidence that made the whole thing feel like it was lining up the way it should. Looking back now, I think that's the part that bothers me the most. How right it all felt at the beginning. I booked the week and spent the days leading up to it working non-stop, just counting down until I could leave. When the day finally came, I packed up, got in the car, and started the drive. It wasn't a short trip, but it was a beautiful one. The kind of drive where you actually don't mind taking your time. There were stretches that got a bit dangerous, sharp turns, steep drops, areas where animals could cross at any moment. But I've always been careful with that. The idea of hitting an animal has always bothered me more than anything else, so I slowed down when I needed to. Paid attention, took my time. It meant getting there later than I could have. But I didn't mind. By the time I arrived, I was in a genuinely good mood. The cabin itself looked even better than I expected. Clean, well-kept, comfortable without losing that rustic feel. I remember texting the owner right away, telling him how happy I was with it, that it absolutely lived up to what I'd paid for. I even texted my mom, half joking, but also kind of serious, saying I might have found a new go-to spot and that my parents should try it sometime because I knew they'd enjoy it too. After that, I put my phone away and decided to make the most of the daylight. I went out for a few hikes, explored some nearby spots I had marked earlier. The trails were a bit demanding, but nothing I wasn't used to. By the time I got back near sunset, I was tired in that good way, the kind that comes from actually doing something physical. I grabbed some firewood before heading inside, knowing the temperature would drop once night set in. That contrast, cold outside, warmth inside, is something I've always loved. There's something about sitting in front of a fireplace that just settles everything down for me. So I got the fire going, took my time making a proper meal, nothing rushed, and by the time I sat down to eat, I was completely relaxed, full, warm, comfortable. Exactly what I had come there for. At some point, I stretched out on the couch. The fire going, TV on in the background, and I must have drifted off without even realizing it. I woke up suddenly. It wasn't midnight yet. I remember checking the time later, but what woke me felt real enough that I sat up immediately. It sounded like a phone ringing somewhere inside the cabin. Not mine, at least not the tone I use, but clearly a phone. It rang twice, maybe 3 times, then stopped. For a second, I was convinced it had been mine. But when I fully came to, there was nothing. No sound, no vibration, no missed call. Just silence. And I sat there, trying to make sense of it. I've had vivid dreams before, the kind that feel real enough to carry over into waking up. So my first instinct was to assume it had been that. Just a dream bleeding into reality for a second. Still, I didn't completely ignore it. I got up, did a quick check around the cabin. Nothing thorough, just enough to reassure myself. I even considered the possibility that maybe a previous guest had left a phone behind somewhere, but that didn't really add up either. The ringing had been too brief, too intentional. Still, nothing seemed out of place, so I let it go. I decided to call it a night, went upstairs, closed the bedroom door. I always sleep with it closed, and got into bed. I was still tired, so I fell asleep pretty quickly. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight hitting my face through the window. And that's something I've always liked, sleeping with the windows open, especially in places like that. It's one of the reasons I usually pick cabins with more than one floor, so I can sleep upstairs, feel a bit more exposed to the outside without actually being exposed. At least, that's what I thought. I woke up with the sunlight hitting my face, and for a few seconds, everything felt exactly the way I wanted it to feel. Calm, quiet, almost too perfect. I remember just lying there, letting that warmth sit on my skin, thinking that maybe this trip had been exactly what I needed after all. It's strange how quickly that kind of feeling can disappear. I rolled over, still half asleep, and looked toward the bedroom door. And that's when everything shifted. The door was open. It wasn't wide open, just enough to immediately feel wrong. And the reaction I had wasn't logical, it was physical. It felt like something in my chest tightened instantly, like my body reacted before my brain had time to catch up. I rarely wake up during the night, especially not in a place like that, where I was already exhausted from the drive and the hiking. I fall asleep, and I stay asleep. And I knew, with absolute certainty, that I had closed that door before going to bed. Still, I didn't have proof, and that's the worst part about moments like these. Your brain immediately starts trying to calm you down, to come up with explanations that make more sense than the obvious one you don't want to accept. Maybe I got up in the middle of the night without remembering. Maybe I didn't close it all the way. Maybe it just looked closed and wasn't. But then that sound from the night before crept back into my mind. That phone ringing. Clear as anything, even if it had stopped almost immediately. And suddenly, it wasn't just one thing anymore. It was two things that didn't line up. I got out of bed and forced myself into a routine, mostly because I didn't know what else to do. I took a shower, hoping it would wake me up enough to shake off that feeling, to ground myself a bit. And for a moment, it worked. The hot water, the familiarity of something normal, it helped, until it didn't. I heard something. It wasn't loud, it wasn't clear, but it was enough. It sounded like movement somewhere else in the cabin. Not something falling, not something random, something deliberate. A door, maybe. And that's when the situation stopped feeling like overthinking. I stepped out of the bathroom and immediately noticed the bedroom door again. This time, it was closed. That was it. That was the moment everything clicked into place in the worst possible way. I had gone to sleep with it closed, woken up with it open, and now it was closed again. There was no version of that sequence that made sense if I was alone. I remember just standing there for a second, completely still, listening, trying to catch any sound that would confirm what I was already starting to believe. For some reason, I still don't fully understand, My first instinct was to check under the bed. Maybe because it's such an obvious place that you almost expect it to be empty. Maybe because part of me still hoped this was all nothing. I got down slowly, trying not to make too much noise, and looked underneath. And that's when I saw it. Right near the head of the bed, pushed up against the wall, there was a blanket. Not like something that had fallen, like something that had been used, tucked, shifted, disturbed in a way that felt intentional. And I didn't need to see anything else. I didn't need movement. I didn't need a face. I didn't need confirmation. My brain filled in the rest instantly. Someone had been under there. Whether they had been sleeping, hiding, watching, I don't know. But the idea that I had been lying right above someone, completely unaware, while they were close enough to hear me breathe, that's something I can't really describe properly. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something that made my whole body feel weak for a second, like I couldn't fully process what I was realizing. After that, everything I did was automatic. I grabbed whatever I could as fast as I could, not even thinking about what I was leaving behind. I called the police while moving, barely able to explain properly what was happening, just giving them the location and telling them there was someone inside the cabin with me. I remember them asking me to stay on the line, but I wasn't really listening anymore. I shoved my phone into my pocket and focused on getting out. I didn't check the rest of the cabin. I didn't try to confirm anything else. I didn't want to see more. I just needed distance between me and that place. I got outside, ran to the car, got in, and drove. I don't even remember if I locked the cabin door. At that point, it didn't matter. I told the police where I was, that I was safe, and that they should still go check the property. The owner was contacted as well, and later I found out he actually made the trip out there himself. When I saw him, I could tell right away he had no idea what had happened. He looked just as shaken as I felt, which ruled out the one theory I had been clinging to, that maybe this was somehow connected to him. The police searched the cabin. They didn't find anyone. No signs of forced entry, no clear evidence of someone being there, nothing that could give a concrete explanation. Just like that, it turned into one of those situations where you're left with more questions than answers and no real way to get closure. I never found out who was in that cabin, or why they were there, or how long they had been there before I even arrived. What I do know is that it changed something in me permanently. I don't look at places the same way anymore, especially places that feel isolated and quiet in a way that used to comfort me. And beds, especially ones with space underneath. I can't deal with them anymore. I check, every single time. Even when I know there's nothing there, even when it doesn't make sense, I still check. Because once you've had that thought, that someone could be right there, hidden in the one place you feel the most vulnerable, it doesn't really go away. This happened about 5 years ago, at a time when I really needed to get away for a while and clear my head. And if I'm being completely honest, my wife and I weren't in the best place either. It wasn't anything dramatic or explosive, nothing like that. It was more the kind of slow tension that builds up when two people spend too much time together without any real space to breathe. where even the smallest thing can turn into an argument simply because you're both already worn down. We both knew the relationship itself was solid, that it had something real underneath all of that. But we also knew we needed distance, not emotionally, just physically. Time to reset, to think clearly again, to stop reacting to every little thing like it mattered more than it actually did. So we came up with what felt like a reasonable plan at the time. We had already booked a cabin out in the Blue Ridge Mountains for a week. Nothing fancy, just something affordable that fit within what we could spend, and we figured we could turn that into something useful for both of us. The idea was simple. We'd each take an extra week off before the actual trip. I would head out there first on my own, and she would stay back at home and have the space to herself. That way we'd both get what we needed. A bit of quiet, a bit of distance. And then after that week, she'd join me at the cabin, and we'd spend the second week together, hopefully in a much better place. It made sense, at least on paper. So when the time came, that's exactly what we did. I packed my things, said goodbye to her, kissed her before I left, and we agreed that in about a week, we'd meet again at the cabin. I'd even planned to hike out a bit to meet her when she arrived, just to make it feel like something different, something a little more intentional. The drive there was actually really pleasant. One of those long, quiet drives where you start to feel like you're already disconnecting from everything you left behind. And by the time I got close, I genuinely felt like this might be exactly what we both needed. That feeling didn't last very long once I actually got there. We already knew the cabin wasn't going to be anything special. We hadn't paid much for it, so I wasn't expecting luxury or anything close to it. But the moment I stepped inside, there were things that immediately didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just that it felt old or a little neglected. It was more about how exposed it felt. The front door didn't seem particularly sturdy, like it would hold up if someone really tried to force it open. And what bothered me even more was the windows. There were no shutters, no curtains, nothing at all that would block the view from the outside. Just glass. Which meant that at night, if I had the lights on inside, anyone out there could see me clearly. Every movement, every detail, while I wouldn't be able to see anything beyond my own reflection. That kind of imbalance, that feeling of being visible without being able to see who might be looking, it got under my skin almost immediately. I actually considered leaving right then and there, just turning around and going back. But we had signed one of those non-refundable agreements before booking, something I didn't think much about at the time, but suddenly felt a lot more real standing there inside that place. We had already spent part of our vacation money on it, and I didn't want to waste that, especially when the whole point of this trip was to step away and reset. So, I told myself I'd give it a couple of days, 2 or 3 at most, see how I felt, and then decide. Maybe it would just take some getting used to. That first night was uncomfortable in a way that's hard to fully explain. I've always been the kind of person who enjoys walking at night. I don't really get bothered by the dark, and the forest itself has never scared me in that way. But I do value privacy, and more than that, I don't like the idea of being watched without knowing who or what is watching me. Still, I tried to act normal. I stepped outside, closed the door behind me, and went for a short walk just to settle in, to get a feel for the place. But something felt off almost immediately. and I couldn't tell if it was just me, if it was the stress I had already built up because of the cabin, or if there was actually something about that place that didn't feel right. I remember feeling tense, more aware of my surroundings than usual, like my body had already decided something was wrong before my mind had caught up. That wasn't normal for me. I'm not particularly intuitive. My wife is much more like that than I am. She picks up on things quickly, trusts her instincts, and if she had been there with me, I honestly don't think she would have stayed a single night. She would have felt it immediately and left. To distract myself, or maybe just to feel a little less alone, I decided to call her while I was walking, just to check in, see how her day had been, keep things normal between us. But as we talked, and as I started explaining what the cabin was like, how exposed it felt, how there were no shutters or curtains, and how isolated the area really was, I could hear the concern in her voice right away. She didn't like it, not at all. She even suggested that maybe we should look into renting a different cabin nearby, something more secure, and that I could go check it out the next day, see if it felt better, safer, and if it did, she'd book it without hesitation. She made it clear she didn't mind spending a bit more if it meant we'd both feel comfortable there. And the longer I stayed on the phone with her, the stranger I started to feel. Not just uneasy, but exposed in a way that didn't make sense given how isolated the place was. I caught myself lowering my voice without realizing it, almost whispering at certain points, like there was someone nearby who shouldn't hear what I was saying, even though logically there shouldn't have been anyone around for miles. It was instinctive, not something I chose to do, and that's what made it worse. When I finally hung up, the silence felt heavier than before. And that's when I heard it. It came from my left. Not footsteps, nothing that clearly pointed to a person. Just this rough, dragging sound against wood, like something had slipped and tried to catch itself. Like fingernails scraping against the surface of a tree trunk as whatever was holding on lost its grip for a second. It wasn't loud, but it was enough. I don't think I can explain that moment any better than this, but whatever I felt right then, it was enough to make me turn around without thinking twice and start walking back toward the cabin as fast as I could without outright running. I've spent plenty of nights in the woods before. I'm used to isolation, to silence, to the kind of darkness that settles in once the sun is completely gone. But there's something very different about knowing you can step inside somewhere solid, close the door, shut the windows, and feel like whatever is out there stays out there. That sense of separation, that barrier, it matters more than people realize until it's gone. And in that cabin, I didn't feel any of that. The moment I got back inside and closed the door, I felt it again. How weak it was. How little it would actually take for someone to force their way in if they wanted to. And instead of feeling safer, I just felt trapped in a slightly smaller space. I didn't turn on the lights. I couldn't. If I did, I knew I wouldn't be able to see anything outside. And at least in the dark, I had the same chance of seeing something as anything out there had of seeing me. So I stayed in the dark. I moved slowly from window to window, keeping myself low, trying to look out without being too visible, scanning the tree line, the bushes, anything that might give me a sign that I wasn't alone out there. I don't know if describing it like this really does it justice, but those were some of the most unsettling minutes I've ever experienced. There's something deeply wrong about standing in complete darkness, surrounded by nothing, convinced something might be out there, and having absolutely no way to confirm it. I stayed like that for maybe 20 minutes, maybe a little more. Time felt stretched in a strange way. And at one point, at one of the windows, I thought I saw movement. Not clearly, not something I could point to and say with certainty. Just a shift among the bushes near the side of the cabin, subtle enough that I immediately started questioning whether I had actually seen anything at all, or if my mind was just filling in the gaps. That's where it got worse, because at that point, I didn't know what to trust anymore. Part of me felt like I was overreacting, that I was letting the discomfort of the cabin get to me, turning a normal situation into something it wasn't, ruining what was supposed to be a break, a reset. But another part of me kept pushing back, telling me that dismissing it too quickly could be just as dangerous, that if something was actually out there, pretending it wasn't wouldn't make it go away. It would just leave me unprepared. I knew exactly what my wife would have done in that situation. She would have chosen caution without hesitation. She would have rather been wrong and safe than right and in danger. Eventually, after sitting with it long enough, after not seeing anything clearly, not hearing anything else that I could point to, I convinced myself, at least enough to move forward, that I might be exaggerating it, that maybe there was nothing there. So I turned the lights on, and instantly everything outside disappeared. The glass turned into a mirror, reflecting the inside of the cabin back at me, leaving nothing but darkness beyond it. It didn't matter if something was standing just a few feet away from the window. I wouldn't have been able to see it. That's how dark it gets out there once the night fully sets in. There's no ambient light, nothing to help your eyes adjust. That night, I did what I could to feel even slightly safer. I dragged 2 chairs and wedged them under the door handle, knowing it wouldn't stop anyone determined, but at least it would make noise, enough to wake me up if someone tried to get in. After that, I went to bed, or at least I tried to. Falling asleep wasn't easy. The thought kept coming back over and over that someone could be standing just outside the cabin, watching, seeing everything while I had no way of knowing they were there. Even the bedroom didn't help. The cabin sat low to the ground. The windows were at a level where anyone outside would have a clear view in. The only solution I found was in the closet, where there were 2 old blankets. I used both of them to cover the windows completely, blocking the view from outside. It meant I was colder than I would have liked. The nights still had that early spring chill to them, but I preferred that over feeling exposed. I did sleep, eventually, but it wasn't restful. It was the kind of sleep where you never fully let go, where every small sound pulls you halfway back to being awake. By the time morning came, I had already made my decision. I wasn't staying there another night. I was leaving, no question about it. What I wasn't prepared for was what I saw when I pulled the blankets down from the windows. The outside of the glass, especially the one by the bedroom, was covered in handprints. Not just 1 or 2, dozens, smudged, overlapping, as if someone had been pressing their hands against the glass again and again, trying to see through it, trying to understand why they couldn't see inside. The way they were placed, the height, the repetition, it was clear that whoever had been out there had spent time at that window, watching and waiting. That was it for me. Any doubt I had disappeared in that moment. I wasn't imagining things. Someone had been out there while I was walking, while I was inside, while I was trying to convince myself everything was fine. I packed as fast as I could, not caring about organization, just grabbing what mattered and throwing it together. I stepped outside and went straight for the car, moving as fast as I could without looking back. By the time I got there, I was out of breath, more from the adrenaline than anything else. But I got in, locked the doors, and started driving. I didn't call my wife right away. It took me about 20 minutes on the road before I felt far enough away to even think clearly. When I finally did call her, I told her everything. I told her I wasn't just uncomfortable staying in that cabin, I didn't even want to be anywhere near it. The idea of switching to another place nearby wasn't an option anymore. Whatever that was, whoever that was, I didn't want to risk being within reach of it again. I had a few theories, none of them good. Either it was someone who knew that cabin existed and used it to watch whoever stayed there, which is disturbing enough on its own, or it was someone who just happened to come across it, which I doubt, because there were too many coincidences for that to make sense. The one that stuck with me the most, the one I couldn't shake, was that it might have been the owner. That the lack of shutters, the lack of privacy, wasn't negligence, it was intentional. That they rented it out knowing exactly what it allowed them to do. I reported it to the police, but they told me there wasn't much they could do. No direct threat had been made. No physical harm had come to me, so there was nothing concrete to act on. One of the officers suggested I try to get a refund, maybe warn people online, share my experience. That was 5 years ago. I know for a fact that at least one other couple rented that same cabin after me and left early, saying they felt watched, unsafe, just like I did. Beyond that, I don't know how many more people have stayed there or how often this happens. What I do know is this. If you ever find yourself in a situation like that, don't try to rationalize it. Don't try to push through it just because you've already paid or because you think you might be overreacting. Trust what you feel. No amount of money is worth your safety. And no place is worth staying in if it makes you feel like you're not alone when you should be. About 5 years ago, I went through one of the most unsettling experiences of my life. It's one of those situations I never really got answers for, and if I'm being honest, I didn't go looking for them either. There was a part of me that felt like digging deeper would only put me in more danger, like some things are better left exactly where they are. At the time, I had just started seeing someone. We'd been talking for about 3 months, and for most of that time, I genuinely believed we were building something real. About a week before all of this happened, we had finally made things official. And to celebrate, he suggested we spend some time away together. He told me about this cabin deep in the woods that used to belong to his uncle, who had passed away and left it to him. He said he'd had it for around 5 years, and that it was a place he went to often, somewhere he felt at peace. The way he described it made it sound quiet, private, almost like a little escape from the world, and he asked if I wanted to go with him for a week. Before I go any further, I want to say something because I've told this story before, and I already know how people react. There's always that tendency to look back and point out what I should have noticed, what I should have questioned, how I should have known better. But the truth is, normal people don't go through life assuming everything is a threat. You don't analyze every word, every gesture, every invitation like it's dangerous. You trust, you interpret things in good faith, and sometimes that puts you in situations you don't fully understand until you're already in them. That doesn't make it your fault. So, yes, maybe I could have paid more attention. Maybe I could have said no. Maybe I could have reacted differently, but I didn't, and that doesn't make what happened my responsibility. At the time, the way he suggested the trip felt almost romantic in a very simple, unforced way. He made it sound like something special, like it meant something to him to bring me there. There was a moment where he started with that typical line, "I don't usually bring people here. This place is personal to me," that kind of thing. And I remember feeling slightly uncomfortable, like it was a bit too rehearsed. It didn't feel completely natural, but I brushed it off. I figured maybe he was just nervous or trying to impress me in his own awkward way. People do that. They exaggerate. They dramatize things a little, especially early on. So, I didn't push it. I told him it was fine, that I'd love to go, and even joked that I could help him fix the place up a bit while we were there, give it a more lived-in feel. He seemed to like that idea. The moment we arrived, though, something felt off, and it hit me immediately. The smell was the first thing. It wasn't subtle. It wasn't something you could ignore or get used to slowly. It was strong, invasive, almost physical. My body reacted before I could even process it properly. It wasn't just unpleasant, it felt wrong. The closest thing I can compare it to is the smell of something dead. But even that doesn't fully capture it. There was something about it that triggered a kind of instinctive alarm, like my body was trying to tell me to leave before my brain had caught up. He noticed my reaction right away and was quick to explain it. He said that in areas like that, it wasn't unusual. Animals die in the woods all the time. Sometimes they get trapped. Sometimes they end up under structures, and the smell can linger. He said it so casually, so matter of fact, that for a second I questioned myself instead of him. I'm not someone who grew up around forests. I'm a city person. I don't have that kind of reference. So I told myself maybe this was normal, maybe I just wasn't used to it. We even tried to figure out where it was coming from. We walked around the cabin, checked different corners, different rooms. But the smell didn't seem localized. It was just everywhere, like it had settled into the place itself. Eventually, we just assumed it was coming from outside, and that the wind was carrying it in. He even mentioned that he'd spent so much time there that he barely noticed it anymore, which, at the time, I tried to accept. But deep down, it didn't sit right. That kind of smell doesn't just become background noise. Not like that. I remember telling him I was glad I'd brought perfume, because there were moments where it genuinely made me feel nauseous. I even asked if maybe we should consider leaving, finding somewhere else, because I didn't think I could handle a whole week like that. that's when his tone changed. It wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. He went from calm and reassuring to irritated, almost defensive. He said I was overreacting, that I was acting like a child, that this was a normal thing, and if I wasn't comfortable, maybe I shouldn't have come at all. There was something sharp in the way he said it. Something that caught me off guard. It felt mean. And I remember thinking, maybe I'm the one being unfair. Maybe I showed up to his place and immediately started complaining. Maybe I was being ungrateful. So I tried to dial it back, told myself I just needed a day or two to adjust, that the smell would fade or I'd get used to it. But that first night was awful. He fell asleep almost instantly, completely undisturbed, while I spent hours going back and forth to the bathroom, spraying perfume, even showering in the middle of the night, because I felt like the smell was clinging to my skin. It made me feel physically dirty in a way I can't fully explain. The next morning, I told him again that I wasn't comfortable, that maybe we should leave early. I asked if there was any way to call someone, get a ride, anything. That's when he told me there was no signal out there, that they hadn't come with any intention of staying connected, that the whole point was to be off the grid, just the two of us. And again, the way he said it wasn't gentle. It felt like he was already losing patience with me. He said he was tired of hearing me complain, that I was ruining the experience over something stupid, and that if I wanted, I could go for a walk and clear my head. He said that's what he was going to do, go out for a while, and that I could either come with him or stay behind. Something about the way he spoke to me in that moment really got to me. Not just what he said, but how he said it. It felt dismissive, almost cold. I was upset, and instead of thinking it through, I reacted. I told him to go, that I'd stay. And that's when I noticed it. That brief hesitation. It was subtle, but it was there. Like he didn't fully expect that answer, like he actually wanted me to go with him. For a second, it felt like he was reconsidering, like he was about to insist. But then he just said, "Fine," and left. 3 months into a relationship is nothing. That's still supposed to be the easy phase, where everything feels light, where people are on their best behavior. And at that point, I remember thinking very clearly, the moment I get out of here, this is over. Whatever this was, it wasn't something I wanted to be part of. But at the same time, I was aware of the situation I was in. I didn't know where I was exactly. I didn't know how to navigate the forest. I had no signal, no way to contact anyone. I was completely dependent on the person I had just decided I didn't trust. So, I made a decision. I would play along. I wouldn't confront him. I wouldn't escalate anything. I'd wait until we left, and then I'd walk away from the relationship safely. It wasn't about being dishonest. It was about protecting myself. Because the reality is, you hear too many stories of situations turning dangerous the moment someone feels rejected. And I wasn't willing to take that risk. I stood there, watching him walk away into the trees, and for the first time since we'd arrived, I felt completely alone. For about 20 minutes after he left, I just sat there on the couch, completely still, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do next. My mind kept going in circles, running through options, but none of them felt real or possible. I didn't know where I was. I didn't know how far the nearest road was. I didn't even know which direction I would need to go if I tried to leave on my own. But at the same time, sitting there doing nothing didn't feel right either. So I convinced myself to at least try to understand the smell, to prove, one way or another, whether I had been overreacting or not. Part of me still wanted to believe he was right, that this was something explainable, something normal that I just wasn't used to. I started inside the cabin first, checking every room, every corner, looking for anything that could explain it. A small animal, something trapped, anything. But there was nothing. Then I went outside, walked around the clearing, checked the immediate area around the house, but again, nothing. That's when I remembered the storage structure a bit further out, still within the property, but slightly removed from the main cabin. We had passed by it the day before, and I remembered very clearly that it was locked with a padlock. He had told me it was off limits, that it held his uncle's and his father's belongings, things he wasn't ready to go through yet. At the time, I had actually found that kind of touching. It sounded like grief, like someone holding on to memories until they felt strong enough to face them. But that was also the area where the smell felt strongest. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe something had gotten in through the structure. It was old, worn down, and died inside. Or maybe it really was just the age of the place. Materials breaking down, something chemical I didn't understand. But there was a window on the side, and when I leaned in to look, I noticed something strange. The frame was rusted, stiff, like it hadn't been touched in years. But when I pressed against it, I could feel that it wasn't fully sealed. Like it was technically closed, but not locked into place. And with a bit more force, I realized I could probably open it. I wasn't prepared for what happened when I did. The smell that came out of that space hit me like a wall. It was sharp, acidic, overwhelming in a way that made my eyes water instantly. I started tearing up without even realizing it, my body reacting before I could think. It was so much worse than outside, so much more concentrated, that for a second I almost stepped back and closed the window again. I should have. Instead, I leaned in further, trying to see inside. What I saw is something I still struggle to put into words in a way that feels accurate. The entire interior looked like it had been turned into bare earth, like the floor had been dug up and disturbed over and over again. There were tools scattered around, knives, axes, things that didn't belong in a space like that. Not arranged, not stored, just left there. And off to one side, there was a blanket on the ground, dirty, soaked through, stained in a way that didn't leave much room for interpretation. I didn't even have time to fully process all of that before my eyes shifted downward, closer to where I was leaning. And that's when I saw it. A body. There was a woman lying there, partially turned, still dressed. And the only reason I noticed her at first was because of her hand. It was positioned just right for the light from the window to catch something. A ring. That's what drew my attention. And the moment I focused on it, everything else fell into place. The ring was identical to the one he had given me a week earlier. I didn't think. I didn't question it. My body just reacted. I ran back to the cabin as fast as I could, barely aware of how I got there, grabbed whatever I could carry, my phone, the essentials, the small first aid kit I had packed, and shoved everything into my bag. I couldn't stop crying. I was shaking so badly I could barely hold on to anything, and my breathing was completely out of control. It felt like my entire body had switched into survival mode all at once. And then I ran. I ran straight into the forest without any sense of direction, without any plan. I didn't care about getting lost. I didn't care about animals. I didn't care about anything except getting as far away from that place as possible. I had no idea how long I was running for. I'm not athletic, not even close. But in that moment, it didn't matter. Adrenaline does things to your body you don't think are possible. I just kept going, pushing past every limit I thought I had, until eventually my body forced me to stop. I remember collapsing, trying to breathe, crying uncontrollably for maybe 15 minutes before forcing myself up again. And then I kept going. Slower this time, but still moving, still trying to put as much distance as I could between me and that cabin. By the time it was starting to get dark, I was convinced he had already gone back, seen the open window, realized I had found out. I was sure he would come after me. That thought alone kept me moving. And then, finally, I saw another cabin. I don't even remember reaching it properly. I just remember banging on the door, begging for help. A family lived there, people I had never seen before, and they let me in without hesitation. They could tell something was wrong immediately. They told me they didn't have signal either, but they had a satellite phone, and that they would call for help. That was the first moment I felt something close to relief, even though the panic never really left. Part of me was still afraid that somehow this could be connected, that I had just walked into something worse. But there was nothing about them that felt wrong. They were kind, calm, grounded in a way that made me feel safe enough to finally breathe. About an hour and a half later, park rangers and police arrived. From that point on, everything moved quickly. They were incredibly professional, incredibly kind. I was taken to the hospital, kept under observation, and they handled everything with a level of care I honestly wasn't expecting. One of the officers explained that in situations like this, especially involving relationships, the priority is always the victim's safety and privacy. My identity was protected, and everything was handled discreetly. Later, I found out I had run much farther than I thought, miles. Enough that the family who helped me didn't even know that cabin existed. They had no connection to it at all. The area was searched, and when authorities got there, the smell was still present. There were signs that something had happened, disturbed ground, indications that the space had been used, but everything I had seen was gone. No body, no blanket, no tools, nothing concrete left behind. But the dogs reacted. They brought in cadaver dogs, and they alerted in that exact area. Something had been there. It's been 5 years now. The case is still open. I've never seen him again. I moved, completely changed where I live. I'm not in witness protection or anything like that, but I made sure he would never be able to find me. As far as I know, he's still being investigated, but nothing has been made public. No arrests, no closure. And that's the part that's hardest to live with, because I know what I saw. And somewhere out there, there's at least one family that still doesn't know what happened to someone they lost. Meanwhile, he's still out there, still free, still able to exist like nothing ever happened. And I'm the one left waiting, stuck with something I can't forget and can't prove. Hi, my name is John. What I'm about to tell you happened around 2 months ago. And I'll be honest, at the time, I don't think I gave it the weight it deserved. It was definitely unsettling in the moment. But I brushed a lot of it off. Didn't really stop to think about how wrong things actually were. It's only been over these last couple of days, being back home, replaying everything over and over again in my head, going through every detail, every decision, everything I ignored, that I've realized how bad it could have gone. I got out of it fine, nothing actually happened to me physically, but looking back, it was one of the strangest and most genuinely disturbing situations I've ever been in. At the time, I didn't even know what to think, because I had never experienced anything like that before. And that uncertainty made it worse. To get straight to it, I've always been someone who enjoys spending time in the mountains. And I've spent a lot of time in the woods, camping, hiking, climbing. I've done a bit of the Pacific Crest Trail, spent some time camping down in Texas too. But one thing about me is that I've never really done any of it alone. I've always had people with me. The truth is, I'm not great with isolation. I don't handle being alone very well, and I don't really handle being left alone with my own thoughts either. I don't like being at home alone. I don't like doing things by myself. And as I got older, I started realizing that's not exactly a great trait to have. It makes you impulsive, in a way. The first thought that comes into your head is usually the one that comes out of your mouth, because you're not used to sitting with your thoughts, breaking them down, actually thinking things through properly. It was actually my girlfriend who pointed that out to me, and over time I realized she was right. It was affecting me more than I wanted to admit. So, this time I decided to do something different. I planned a short trip, 3 nights out in the Appalachians, and I made a point of doing it alone. The idea was to force myself into that space, to sit with it, to get used to it. The first part would be proper camping, and then for the last 2 nights, I booked a cabin that was relatively close to a small town. Not completely isolated, but still remote enough to feel like it. The cabin itself was cheaper because it was shared. Basically, it had a ground floor and an upper floor, both fully independent. Separate kitchens, separate bathrooms, everything. The only connection between them was an internal door. But it wasn't like a front door. It wasn't that solid. Still, the owner made it sound safe. He said he always knew who was staying there, had everyone's details, did some basic checks. Before booking, I even told him I was flexible with dates and asked if there was a weekend where I'd most likely be alone there. He said that for the dates I picked, nobody else had booked. I even checked again about a week before leaving, just to be sure, and he confirmed it, so I went ahead with it. The first 3 days went great, no issues at all. Honestly, it was better than I expected. I was a little on edge, just because I'm not used to being alone like that, and isolation does mess with your head a bit. But nothing major. Everything felt under control. That changed when I got to the cabin. At first, it seemed empty. I got there, settled in, nothing unusual. But maybe 5 minutes after I walked in, I heard footsteps upstairs, clear as day, and right away, I knew I wasn't alone there. I won't lie, I was a bit annoyed. Not because it wasn't allowed, but because the owner hadn't told me. Still, I knew it was always a possibility, so I tried not to let it bother me too much. I checked the door connecting the 2 floors, and it was actually sturdier than I expected, which helped a bit. My plan was simple, just avoid them as much as possible. I didn't feel like socializing, I just wanted my space. That first night, I noticed something that already felt off. During the day, I barely heard anything from upstairs. But as soon as it got dark, they started moving around constantly. Back and forth, non-stop. It went on for hours. I barely slept. The next morning, I decided to go talk to them. Not in a confrontational way, just to introduce myself, be polite, and maybe get a sense of who they were. I knocked, they answered, and right away I could tell something was off. And I don't mean that lightly. They were genuinely strange. The way they looked, the way they spoke, the way they carried themselves. It all felt wrong in a way that's hard to explain without sounding paranoid. But I'm not exaggerating. There was just something about them. They told me they were night people, said they slept during the day and stayed up all night, moving around, doing their own thing. I didn't really know what to say to that. I just asked if they could maybe keep the noise down a bit during the night, because I was trying to sleep. They didn't apologize, didn't really react much at all, just kind of acknowledged it. So I left it at that and went back downstairs. I spent the rest of the day out hiking, trying not to think too much about it, but it stuck with me. The whole interaction just didn't feel right. That evening, when I got back, they were both at the window upstairs, watching me as I walked in. They waved. I waved back, trying to keep things normal. As soon as I got inside, they came downstairs and knocked on my door. Started asking how my day was, making small talk. Then they invited me to have dinner with them. I thanked them, but I said no. I explained that I had booked the trip to spend some time alone, that I needed that space. And that's when their attitude shifted. It was subtle, but noticeable. They didn't like that answer. I tried to smooth it over, made it clear it wasn't about them, just something I needed personally. Eventually, they left, but the vibe was off. That night, I was expecting another restless night with all the noise, but around 11 p.m., I heard their door open and close, and then footsteps heading away from the cabin. I assumed they were going on one of their night walks, which honestly was a relief. It meant I might actually get some sleep. And I did, for a few hours. Around 4 a.m., I woke up. I tend to wake up a few times during the night anyway, usually to go to the bathroom, so that part wasn't unusual. What was unusual was what I saw when I opened my eyes. They were both outside my window, right up against the glass, just standing there, looking in at me while I slept. I can't even describe the kind of shock that hit me in that moment. I jumped up immediately, went to the window, and asked them what the hell they were doing. And the worst part? They didn't even try to hide it. They didn't look embarrassed, didn't try to come up with an excuse. They just said they had seen me sleeping and wanted to check if I was okay, if I was finally getting some rest after the night before. At that point, I was already irritated. But more than that, I was uncomfortable in a way that's hard to explain. I told them straight up that they couldn't do that it wasn't okay. I went to close the curtains, something I hadn't even thought was necessary before, which in hindsight feels insane, but at the time, it just didn't cross my mind. As you can probably imagine, I spent the rest of that night completely awake, just lying there staring at the ceiling, going over what had just happened again and again in my head. There wasn't even a question of going back to sleep. I kept thinking about the way they were standing there, how normal they acted about it, how none of it felt right. It wasn't just uncomfortable, it crossed into something else entirely, something that didn't sit right no matter how much I tried to rationalize it. I kept asking myself why they were even there, why they felt the need to watch me like that. And the more I thought about it, the worse it got. That was supposed to be my last night at the cabin anyway, but even if it hadn't been, there's no way I would have stayed another one after that. As soon as morning came, I didn't waste any time. I packed everything up as quickly as I could, didn't go upstairs, didn't try to talk to them, didn't even want to risk another interaction. I just wanted to get out of there. I made sure I had my things, threw everything into the car, and left. I didn't run, but I moved with that same urgency. Like my body just wanted distance between me and that place as fast as possible. Once I was out of the forest and back on a proper road, I finally called the owner and told him that something really uncomfortable had happened, that there had been people staying in the upper level and that their behavior had crossed a line. There was a pause on the phone, and then he told me something that, honestly, made everything feel even worse. He said there was no one else booked at the cabin. According to him, I was supposed to be the only person there. And that just added a whole other layer to it. Because then what was that? What exactly had I spent 2 nights living with? 2 people who were clearly there before I arrived, who acted like they belonged there, who moved around all night, who watched me sleep, and somehow weren't supposed to be there at all. No booking, no record, nothing. I don't have answers to any of that, and honestly, I'm not even sure I want them. All I know is that this has been stuck in my head for the past 2 months. The more I think about it, the less sense it makes, and the more it bothers me. It's one of those situations where nothing technically happened, but at the same time, something definitely wasn't right. It just made me realize how strange people can be, how unpredictable, and how quickly a situation that seems completely normal can turn into something that genuinely unsettles you. I do know one thing though. I'm not making those same mistakes again. I'm not sleeping in a cabin with open visibility like that, where anyone can just stand outside and look in. I don't know how I didn't think about that before, but I won't ignore it again. And I'm definitely not staying in shared cabins with people I don't know, no matter how much cheaper it is. It's just not worth it. I've always been the kind of person who feels most at ease out in the mountains. Over the years, I've hiked and climbed in a lot of different places across the US. But there's something about the Appalachian range that keeps pulling me back. It's not the folklore or the stories people like to attach to it. It's much simpler than that. The geology, the terrain, the sheer variety you get within relatively short distances. It's one of the few places that never really feels repetitive to me. Because I work remotely, I've been able to take advantage of that and spend long stretches of time out there, moving around, camping, climbing, just living a bit outside the usual routine. A lot of the time, I manage to bring people along, friends from work who can do the same. But I've also done plenty of those trips alone. The one I'm about to tell you about happened roughly 2 springs ago, and to this day, I still don't really know what to make of it. All I know is that whenever it crosses my mind, I get this immediate physical reaction, like a chill that doesn't quite make sense. I come from a background where people tend to look for logical explanations first, where anything that even leans toward the unexplained gets dismissed pretty quickly. So, it's not exactly the kind of story I've had many chances to share. But it did happen, and it stuck with me in a way very few things ever have. Getting straight to it, I was hiking and climbing through a section of the Appalachians on the West Virginia side, fairly far up, close enough to more remote stretches that you don't see many people for days at a time. I'd already been out there for about a week, and I knew going in that the weather could shift quickly. I was prepared for temperature drops, for rain, for the usual unpredictability. But there was a point where it started coming down a lot harder than I expected. Not just a passing shower, steady, heavy rain that didn't look like it was going anywhere anytime soon. So I started looking for some kind of cover, just somewhere to wait it out. That's when I spotted a structure off in the distance. As I got closer, I realized it was some kind of cabin sitting up on a small rise. From afar, I couldn't tell if it had been someone's home at some point, or if it was one of those old fire lookout structures you sometimes find in that region. If it was a lookout, it would have been perfect. Once I reached it and stepped inside, it became pretty clear that it had been abandoned for a long time. It didn't have that semi-maintained look those lookout towers usually have, where hikers still pass through and use them occasionally. This felt different. The place was in rough shape, worn down in a way that suggested no one had cared about it in years. I tried the lights out of habit, but nothing worked. Still, with a flashlight, I could see enough to tell that it had once been lived in. There were remnants of furniture. The layout made sense as a home, just left behind. Even in that state, it did what I needed it to do. It kept the rain off me, gave me a chance to sit down and wait things out for a bit. I had no intention of staying long, definitely no intention of sleeping there. But this is where one of my worst habits kicked in. I've always had this ability, if you want to call it that, to fall asleep almost anywhere. It doesn't matter if I'm on a bus, a train, sitting in a corner at a friend's place, even in situations where I probably shouldn't feel comfortable enough to sleep. I just do. It's been useful at times, but it's also gotten me into situations I probably could have avoided. That day was one of them. I leaned back into a corner, telling myself I'd just rest for a minute while the rain eased up. The place didn't exactly feel welcoming. There was something off about it. But I was tired, a bit worn down from the past few days, and before I really registered it, I'd closed my eyes. When I woke up, it wasn't gradual. It was one of those sudden, sharp wake-ups where your body reacts before your mind catches up. I didn't even know what had pulled me out of sleep, just that something felt wrong. I opened my eyes and, across from me, in the opposite corner of the cabin, there was a shape. At first, my brain tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a coat hanging off something. Maybe part of the structure casting a shadow in a strange way. But the longer I looked, the less convincing those explanations felt. There was a stillness to it that didn't match an object, but at the same time, it wasn't moving enough to immediately register as a person either. I just sat there, completely still, trying to figure out what I was looking at, hoping, honestly, that it was anything other than someone standing there watching me. After a few seconds that felt way longer than they should have, I slowly reached for my flashlight and aimed it directly at the shape. I don't know exactly what I expected, but I definitely wasn't prepared for how it reacted. The moment the light hit it, it moved, fast, almost instinctively, like someone flinching from sudden brightness. It raised something in front of its face, let out this strange, strained sound that didn't quite sound like a normal shout, and kind of folded into itself. That was enough. I didn't wait to understand it, didn't try to get a better look. I just panicked. I bolted out of that cabin without thinking twice. I'm pretty sure I left one of my bags behind, but luckily, it wasn't anything essential. I had what I needed on me, and at that point, survival instinct just took over. I ran straight into the rain, not even caring about the terrain, just putting as much distance as I could between me and that place. I kept going until I found a shallow rock overhang where I could at least get partially out of the rain and catch my breath. Even then, my mind wouldn't settle. What I'd seen inside that cabin, it had to be a person. But I couldn't understand how. I had checked the place when I came in, swept it with the flashlight, and I was almost certain no one had been there. So where did that person come from? How long had they been there? Were they already inside, just out of sight, watching me the entire time I was asleep? The longer I sat there thinking about it, the worse it felt. I must have been under that rock for close to an hour when I heard something in the distance. A shout. It didn't come from the direction of the cabin. This sounded different, clearer, like an actual call for help. It sounded like a man. Given how slick the ground had gotten with the rain, it wasn't hard to imagine someone slipping, getting hurt. So, despite everything that had just happened, I decided to check it out. I started calling back, moving toward the sound, and eventually I found him. An older man, probably in his 70s, who had slipped while trying to follow his dog into the woods. He told me he'd heard something out there. The dog had taken off after it, and he'd gone after the dog and lost his footing. He'd tried calling for his wife, who was still back at their place, but she hadn't heard him. I helped him up, made sure he was okay, and after a bit, we managed to locate the dog, which had circled back once it heard him calling. From there, I helped both of them make their way back to their cabin. On the way, he asked me what I was doing out there, and I explained that I'd been hiking and got caught in the rain. He didn't hesitate. He offered me a place to stay for the night, said I could crash on their pull-out couch until the weather cleared. I was still shaken from what had just happened, and the idea of being somewhere warm, taking a shower, eating a proper meal. It sounded exactly like what I needed in that moment. Older couples like that tend to be incredibly kind, and more often than not, they know how to make you feel at home without trying too hard. So, I accepted. They were both genuinely welcoming. I got cleaned up, started to relax a little, and for the first time since leaving that other cabin, I felt like my body was starting to come down from the adrenaline. I'll be honest though, I wasn't planning on bringing up what had just happened. We were sitting down for dinner later that night, and for the first time since everything had happened, things started to feel normal again. Warm food, conversation, the kind of environment that makes your body finally unclench without you even realizing it. That's when his wife casually mentioned that her husband had been very lucky to run into me out there. Especially given how unpredictable the terrain gets after heavy rain. She smiled and added that their dog was usually very sweet, really well behaved, but that every now and then he'd get spooked by something they couldn't hear. She pointed vaguely in the direction of the hill and said that, for some reason, it always seemed to be connected to that old cabin up there. According to her, the dog would sometimes pick up on sounds coming from that direction, sounds neither of them could hear, and would go from calm to completely agitated in seconds, running off toward the cabin, barking like something was there. She even laughed a little, saying they never understood how he could hear anything from that distance, but dogs hear things we don't, so they just chalked it up to that. The moment she said that, I felt it hit me. I don't even know how to describe it properly, but it was like all the blood drained from my face at once. I think it showed because she immediately stopped mid-sentence and asked if I was okay, if something was wrong. That's when I told them. I explained that I had actually been inside that cabin earlier, that I hadn't seen anyone when I first walked in, that I had checked the place, and that everything seemed empty. But then I told them how I'd fallen asleep, and how when I woke up, there was someone, or something, there in the corner with me. I didn't try to dramatize it. I just said exactly what I had experienced. They both went quiet for a second and exchanged a look. Not the kind of look people give when they think you're joking or exaggerating, but the kind that carries a shared understanding, like they both already knew something you didn't. The man was the one who spoke first. He told me that they had been living out there for over 20 years, and that even back then, the cabin up on that hill belonged to someone who kept mostly to himself. About 2 decades ago, that man had taken his own life inside that same cabin. He was found there, alone, and after that, no one ever really claimed the place. It just sat there, slowly falling apart, left to the elements. He went on to say that over the years, a lot of people passing through had mentioned strange things about it. Nothing consistent enough to form a clear story, but enough to give the place a reputation. Some said it felt wrong the moment you stepped inside. Others said they heard things, movement, sounds that didn't make sense. He even mentioned that behind the cabin, there were markings, symbols carved or painted into the wood and nearby surfaces. No one seemed to know exactly what they meant, but people associated them with occult stuff, rituals, things along those lines. Whether that was true or just people letting their imagination run, he couldn't say. What he did say was that they avoided that place as much as possible. The only time they ever went near it was when the dog ran off like that. And even then, they tried to call him back before he got too close. He told me the dog was usually incredibly obedient, calm, affectionate, but whenever it reacted to whatever was coming from that cabin, it was like something flipped. It stopped listening completely. The only thing it focused on was getting there and barking, like it was reacting to something very real in its mind. After that conversation, I didn't say much. I finished dinner, thanked them again, but my head was somewhere else entirely. That night, lying on that couch, I kept replaying everything, what I had seen, how it moved when the light hit it, the sound it made, and now this added layer of context they had given me. I tried to line it up with something logical, something grounded, but nothing quite fit in a way that felt convincing. I finished the rest of my trip after that, but I kept my distance from that area. I didn't go back to that cabin, didn't even pass near it again. And like I said before, I haven't really shared this with many people. It's hard to explain something when you don't fully understand it yourself. Especially when you come from a mindset where things are supposed to have clear explanations. I'm not someone who easily jumps to anything supernatural. I've always leaned toward rational explanations first. But whatever I saw in that cabin, it didn't feel like something I could just explain away.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
What I'm about to tell you happened more than 45 years ago. Back when my family managed to handle everything on our own, though it was one of the most terrifying moments I can remember. Recently, I saw something on the news that felt disturbingly similar, and it brought all of this back to me, which is why I'm telling it again now. I've shared it a few times over the years, even though it didn't happen directly to me, or rather, I was there when it happened. But I wasn't the one it happened to. I'll explain. At the time, we were living in West Virginia, and back then, there were areas, more than there are now, where people lived in extreme isolation, sometimes in pretty miserable conditions. Those places still exist, but they were far more common then. People didn't have access to much, information was limited, and a lot of them didn't even know how to get out of the situation they were in. It was like a trap of poverty. Today, those situations still exist in different forms, but back then, things were harsher, more raw. I was lucky enough to grow up in a family that had resources. We weren't struggling, not even close. We had vacations, toys, everything a kid could ask for. I had 4 siblings, which today would already be considered a big family, but back then, it wasn't that unusual. On top of that, I had around 11 cousins, so when we all got together, it felt like chaos in the best possible way. One of my uncles owned a large house by a lake deep in the Appalachian mountains. The house is still in the family to this day. I'm not going to say exactly where it is, because the last thing we'd want is to draw attention to it. But it's in a very remote area. The place itself is massive, almost like a mansion, right by the water, with multiple bedrooms and the kind of size that requires constant upkeep. Every year, the entire family would gather there for 1 or 2 weeks. We'd go more than once throughout the year, but that particular trip, the one I'm talking about, happened in the spring. It wasn't quite summer yet, but it already felt like it in that part of the country. The weather was warm, the lake looked inviting, and we spent most of our time outside. The younger ones played games. We all swam under strict supervision, especially after one of my cousins had almost drowned there 2 years earlier, which made the adults a lot more cautious. The first 3 or 4 days passed like any other. Looking back, I'm aware that memory isn't perfect. Over the years, details blur. Some things might get distorted. But there are parts of this story that are burned into my mind so clearly that I know they happened exactly the way I remember them. One night, after those first few days, I was sitting by the window in the room I shared with one of my cousins, just staring out at the lake. I always liked doing that, watching the moon reflect off the water. It was quiet, the kind of silence you only get in places far away from everything. At some point, I noticed what looked like a faint reflection of light coming from the tree line right beside the house. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but in that kind of darkness, where the only real source of light was the moon on the lake, even the smallest change stands out. I kept looking, not really thinking much of it at first, until I realized something in that area was moving. It was almost imperceptible, especially with the wind rustling through the trees. But there was a difference. The wind usually moved the tops of the trees, the higher branches. But this was lower, closer to the ground, where there were bushes and undergrowth. And in that dim light, I was almost certain I had seen something shift. I told my cousin there might be some kind of predator near the house. I didn't actually know that, of course, but it felt like the kind of thing we'd say to each other, half serious, half trying to scare one another. We immediately started building a story around it, planning how we'd tell the younger kids the next day and freak them out a little. That was just what we did as the older cousins. I didn't think much more about it after that. I went to bed, and the next morning we told the story, just like we had planned. The problem is, one of my younger cousins, Lucy, had her own story to tell. That night, she had woken up crying and gone to her parents, saying there was a man at her bedroom window. Her parents got up immediately, alarmed, and from what I later understood, some of the adults went outside to check the perimeter of the house. I hadn't noticed any of this happening at the time, but there had been a search, people moving around, trying to see if anyone was out there. My cousin and I didn't mention what we had seen the night before. Suddenly, the idea that it might not have been an animal didn't feel like a joke anymore. At the time, I remember thinking it was strange that her window had been open, especially since her room was on the ground floor. In those areas, you usually keep everything closed at night. But the truth is, because nothing had ever happened there before, because the house felt so remote and hidden, people got comfortable. Maybe too comfortable. They searched the house and the surrounding area and found nothing. No signs, no footprints, Nothing to suggest that anyone had actually been there. In the end, they told Lucy it had just been a bad dream and tried to calm her down. The next day went on as usual. We spent time by the lake, played. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing felt wrong. But that night, I went back to the same window. I stood there for a while, maybe 15 minutes, just staring into the darkness, trying to see if I could spot anything again. After a bit, my cousin joined me and asked what that shape was on the opposite side from where I had seen the light the night before. I followed his gaze, and there it was, a shadow. It looked like the outline of a person standing there, partially hidden between the trees. We squinted, trying to make sense of it, thinking it might be one of our uncles. It wouldn't have been unusual for them to step outside for a cigarette. Most of them smoked back then, and sometimes they'd wander a bit while doing it. From where we stood, we couldn't make out any clear features. But every now and then, there was a faint glow, small and brief, like the tip of a cigarette lighting up in the dark. So we assumed that's what it was. We opened the window slightly and waved. Whoever it was waved back. Then the figure turned and walked toward the lake, disappearing into the trees. Once again, we just assumed it had to be one of our uncles, someone who had stepped outside for a cigarette and decided to take a short walk near the trees. I know that now it might sound strange, and maybe if I had been older, I would have questioned it more, especially knowing what happened afterward. But the truth is we were 12 years old, in a place we believed was completely safe, so the idea of real danger never fully crossed our minds. It also wasn't unusual. Some of our uncles, and even a couple of our aunts, would go outside at night. Two of my aunts, in particular, were a bit rebellious for that time, especially considering how society treated women back then, and they were actually some of my favorites. They smoked, they walked around at night, they didn't really follow the rules people expected them to follow. So, in our heads, it made perfect sense that it could have been one of them, even if, from what we saw, it looked more like a man. So we ignored it, went back to bed, and figured we'd just ask at breakfast who had waved back at us. But that's when things started to shift. The next morning we asked casually, expecting someone to laugh and admit it. But no one did. None of our uncles, none of our aunts. No one had been outside in that area at that time. And suddenly, there were two separate things that didn't line up anymore. We had seen someone near the house, and Lucy, even if she was young, had said there was a man at her window. You could feel the tension at the table change. It wasn't dramatic, no one panicked, but there was a subtle shift, like something unspoken had just settled in the room. For the first time, it felt like maybe we weren't as alone out there as we had always believed. That night, everything was different. All the windows were shut and locked. Every door checked multiple times. Some of my uncles even went up to the attic, the highest point in the house, where you could see all around the property, and they took turns watching, scanning the tree line, trying to catch any movement. But they didn't see anything. After that, a few days passed, maybe 2 or 3, and nothing else happened. No shadows, no lights, and no signs of anyone. Slowly, people began to relax again. The explanation that made the most sense was that it had been someone passing through. After all, Even if the house itself sat on private property, the surrounding forest didn't belong to us. And it wasn't impossible for hikers or strangers to wander through, spot the house, get curious, maybe linger a bit. So, eventually, things went back to normal. About a week after we had arrived, we were all outside playing hide and seek in the forest, both the younger kids and the older ones. There were rules, of course. We weren't allowed to play after dark, and we weren't supposed to go too far beyond the perimeter of the house. The younger kids followed those rules, but the older ones, like me, sometimes bent them a little. We knew better hiding spots, places slightly farther out, spots that gave us an advantage. I had one in particular, a small recess between some rocks, far enough that it technically broke the rules, but still close enough that I could see the house through the trees if the lights were on, and I could hear voices, hear my cousin counting as he got ready to come find us. I had been there maybe 2 minutes when I heard something to my right, a sharp and sudden noise. Before I could even process it, I saw him. It was a man moving through the trees, passing incredibly close to where I was hiding. I froze. I remember letting out a small breath, barely more than a whisper. But it was enough. He stopped immediately and looked around. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought he would hear it. I knew that from where I was, he couldn't see me unless he got lower, unless he crouched or stepped closer. I covered my mouth with my hand and stayed completely still. It's hard to explain why that moment felt the way it did, but being there, hidden, alone, knowing that this was the same presence we had noticed before, it was one of the most terrifying things I had ever experienced. After a few seconds, maybe longer, he kept moving. The second I felt safe enough, I got out of that spot and ran. I ran as fast as I could back toward the house, shouting before I even reached it, yelling that the game was over, that this wasn't a joke, that everyone needed to get back inside immediately. They heard it in my voice, and one by one, my cousins and siblings started coming out of their hiding places. My older brother, who was 15 at the time, the only one older than me, grabbed me and asked what was going on. When I told him, he didn't hesitate. He ran to get our parents. Within minutes, everyone was being called inside. Adults were shouting names, making sure every child came back. One by one, we all made it in. Except Lucy didn't. At first, it was just confusion. Then it turned into panic. My aunt and uncle started screaming her name, their voices breaking in a way I had never heard before. We, the kids, were told to stay inside, my older brother watching over us, while all the adults ran back out into the forest. Hours passed. I don't remember how many, but I remember the feeling, the waiting, the silence inside the house, broken only by occasional shouting from outside. My parents talked about calling the police, but back then, in a place that remote, it would take a long time for them to arrive. My uncles believed they could cover more ground themselves at first, that they could find her faster. They searched through the night. They didn't stop. It took about a day and a half before they finally called the police. Once the police got involved, the search expanded. But even then, nothing. No sign of her, no clues, and nothing to suggest where she had gone. 5 days passed like that. Then my Aunt Joanne was walking past one of the storage areas attached to the house, and she found her. Lucy was inside, tied up and barely conscious. She had been there the entire time. None of us had even thought to look there. It was too obvious, too close. No one expected that whoever had taken her would hide her inside the property itself, that close to the house, with so many adults around, some of them armed. It felt impossible, but it had happened. She was rushed to the hospital. They ran tests, and thankfully she hadn't been physically harmed, but there were clear signs in her system that she had been drugged. The police searched everything, the house, the land, and the surrounding forest, but they never found anyone. Obviously, we didn't go back to that house for years after that. Over time, Lucy started remembering small pieces. Not everything, but enough. She remembered his face, said he had a lot of facial hair. She said that at first, he had been kind, that he told her he was a friend of her father, that he knew a really good hiding spot. She was 5 years old. She didn't know what real danger looked like. So she went with him. We never figured out what his actual goal was. If he had truly wanted to kidnap her, he could have taken her with him. He had more than enough opportunities to do it. If he only meant to scare us, then it raises an even darker question. Because what kind of person drugs a child just to make a point or to get some twisted sense of satisfaction out of it? There were whispers over the years, quiet conversations between the adults that we weren't supposed to hear, suggesting it might have been some kind of personal grudge, maybe directed at Lucy's father, who, despite being family and someone I cared about, was known to have made enemies in that area. But even that never turned into anything concrete, just theories that never led anywhere. The truth is, we were left without answers, and sometimes that's worse than knowing. Not understanding why something like that happened, not knowing who was capable of it, it stays with you in a way that's hard to explain unless you've lived through it. It changed all of us. Lucy was never the same again. She became quiet, withdrawn, the kind of child who would hesitate before trusting anyone, even people she had known her entire life. As for the rest of us, that sense of safety we once had, running freely around that house, hiding in the woods without a second thought, it was gone overnight. For years, none of us wanted to go back there. That house, which used to feel like the center of our childhood, full of noise and laughter, suddenly felt exposed, like something could be watching you from the trees at any moment. A few of us did return eventually, older, trying to convince ourselves it had all been a one-time thing, something that couldn't possibly happen again. But it was never the same. We slept lightly, every small noise pulling us awake, every window locked, every door checked more than once before going to bed. No one wandered far from the house anymore, not even during the day. And even now, after all these years, we still don't have an explanation. No suspect, no clear motive, nothing that ties it all together in a way that makes sense. The only thing we can hold on to is that, somehow, it ended without something even worse happening. Because whatever that man intended to do, whatever was going through his head, it could have gone so much further. And that thought alone is enough to make it stay with you for the rest of your life. Hi, my name is Matt, and ever since I can remember, One of the things I wanted most when I grew up was to become a biologist, specifically someone who studies the kind of flora you only find deep in the Appalachian Mountains. I'm originally from West Virginia. I grew up surrounded by those mountains. Even though these days I live in Pennsylvania, still working within the same range, still studying its wildlife and plant life, because there are parts of those mountains that remain barely documented, where sometimes there isn't even a clear scientific explanation for why something grows where it does. And those are the places that have always fascinated me the most. I've always felt comfortable in the mountains, more than comfortable actually. I'd say I respect them more than I fear them. Because if you grow up there, you learn very quickly that most of the bad things that happen aren't about bad luck. They're about people being careless, about not planning properly, about underestimating the environment. I've never been that kind of person. I'm organized, methodical. I plan my trips carefully. I bring what I need. I don't take unnecessary risks. And because of that, I've never really had a situation where I felt truly in danger. Until recently. What happened to me wasn't something I expected at all. It wasn't the mountains turning on me or some kind of natural hazard. It was something else entirely. And looking back, I can see the exact moment where I let my guard down, even if just a little, and how that could have ended a lot worse than it did. About 3 years ago, I came across a plant species in the Appalachians that isn't well documented at all. Something that produces a very unusual kind of fruit. And has been quietly gaining attention because of its potential medicinal properties. Since then, a big part of my work has been focused on studying it, understanding how it grows, how it spreads, what kind of conditions it thrives in, and more importantly, why it exists in the specific locations where we found it. That means a lot of field work, a lot of time spent deep in the mountains, mapping patterns, collecting samples, trying to build something that resembles an explanation. Around 3 months ago, I was assigned a new assistant for the research program I'm part of. Normally, that's a great thing. Most assistants come in eager to learn, motivated, curious, and honestly, it helps a lot with the workload, because this field isn't exactly well paid, and there's a lot more work than people realize, especially with how often science gets dismissed or misunderstood. Over the years, I've worked with several assistants, and I still keep in touch with most of them. They've all been great people. But this one was different. From the very beginning, something about him felt off. He was actually a year older than me. He had just taken a different path and started college later, which wasn't an issue in itself, but there were small things, patterns in his behavior that started to stand out the more I paid attention. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just little moments where something would go wrong for someone else, and he seemed to enjoy it a bit too much. Or the way he reacted to things that most people would find uncomfortable. There was one time on campus when we came across a dead frog. Nothing unusual. It happens. But the way he joked about it wasn't normal. It wasn't just dark humor. It felt like there was something behind it, something that didn't sit right with me. And I know people use humor to deal with discomfort. I've done it myself, but this felt different. There was a certain weight to it, a kind of negativity that followed him around. I'm not the kind of person who judges others quickly. I usually give people the benefit of the doubt, but I'll be honest. There have only been 2 other times in my life where I got that same feeling from someone. And both of those times, I ended up being right to be cautious. Still, he was my assistant, and I had a job to do. So I pushed those thoughts aside and kept things professional. About 3 weeks ago, we were scheduled for a field trip. Just the 2 of us and another colleague from the program who had more experience than both of us combined. The plan was simple. A 2.5-day trip to collect samples and document a specific area where the plant had been spotted before. But a couple of days before we left, our colleague had to cancel because her kid got sick. And since we had already prepared everything, we decided to go ahead with just the 2 of us, keep it simple, get what we needed, and come back. The location itself is something I can't disclose, partly because the research is still ongoing, and partly because places like that can get destroyed if too many people find out about them. Unfortunately, it's happened before. People either vandalize the area or strip it of anything valuable without understanding what they're doing. So, we're required to keep those details confidential. What I can say is that it was remote. No trails nearby. About a 4-hour hike from the nearest accessible point where the team dropped us off. We started early, and I'll give him this. He was fast, faster than I expected, and we made good time getting to the area where we planned to set up camp for the night before heading deeper the next day. We arrived with about an hour of daylight left, which was perfect. Enough time to organize our gear, set up camp, and get some rest before continuing. It was only when I started unpacking that I noticed something was wrong. My first aid kit was missing. That's where everything really started to shift for me. I felt a sharp wave of unease almost immediately. Because this wasn't something clipped to the outside of my pack or hanging loose where it could have fallen off without me noticing. It had been inside my backpack the entire time, stored carefully where I always keep it. I ran through the day in my head, every stop we had made, every moment I had taken the pack off. And there wasn't a single instance where I could remember opening that compartment or leaving my things unattended. For a moment, I questioned myself, wondering if I had somehow forgotten to pack it at all, even though that didn't make sense given how methodical I am with this kind of preparation. Still, I asked him if he had seen a small first aid pouch, trying to keep my tone casual. He answered almost too quickly, saying no, that he hadn't seen anything, but added that it was fine because he had one of his own if we needed it. That should have reassured me, yet it did the opposite. Something about the way he said it didn't sit right, almost as if the response had been prepared, like he had anticipated the question. Based on everything I had observed about him over the past few months, it would have made more sense for him to lean into the problem, to highlight the risk, to let the discomfort linger. Instead, he smoothed it over too easily. And that contradiction was enough to set off a quiet alarm in my head. I know that without you knowing either of us, what I'm saying might sound exaggerated, but trust me, I've spent the last 3 months practically locked in a lab with him. I recognize his behavior patterns by now. I know he enjoys seeing people scared, seeing them uncomfortable. He would never say something to reassure me that everything was fine. And that was his first mistake. I asked him directly if he had gone through my pack at any point. He gave me a flat no, followed by that same dismissive look I had seen him give others. Though this time it was directed at me, and I let it go. I told myself I might be reading too much into it, that maybe I had made a mistake, even if that didn't feel true. We moved on with setting up camp, dividing the tasks like we always did, keeping things efficient, routine, controlled. As night settled in and the light dropped off, he suddenly mentioned he was going for a walk. That alone made me uneasy. We weren't there for leisure. We were there to work, and wandering off in the dark in a remote area introduced risks we didn't need. I told him no, not directly as an order, but firmly enough that it should have been clear. He looked at me again with that same expression, then said he was just going to the bathroom and stepped off into the trees. 10 minutes passed. I stayed where I was, telling myself there was no reason to escalate things, that he might actually just be taking his time. But the silence around me grew heavier with every second. At some point, I realized I couldn't hear him anymore. No footsteps, no movement, nothing at all. I've always had a good ear for sound. Years of music training will do that to you. And what unsettled me wasn't what I heard. It was what I didn't. It felt like he hadn't left the area at all, like he had simply stopped moving and was somewhere just beyond the trees, watching me. Sometime around 3 in the morning, while I was lying there fully awake, I heard the zipper of his tent slide open. I stayed still, listening as his footsteps circled mine, slow and deliberate. Not the kind of movement you make when you're half asleep or stepping out for something normal. My entire body tensed as I heard him stop right outside my tent. Then I felt the faint pressure of a hand against the fabric, followed by the sound of my zipper beginning to move. I said his name immediately and asked if he needed something. The movement stopped at once. The zipper went still, and I heard him pull his hand away like he'd been caught doing something he shouldn't have been doing. He answered that he had heard footsteps and just wanted to check if I was okay. Nothing about that made sense. He wasn't the kind of person who checked on others, not even remotely. And the idea that he had come to make sure I was safe felt completely out of character. That was the moment it became clear to me that something was seriously wrong, and that staying there any longer wasn't an option. I decided right then that we were leaving in the morning. I reached for my satellite phone, intending to call the team and have them pick us up early. But when I opened my pack, it wasn't there. At that point, there was no more doubt. I knew I had brought it. I had seen it that morning before we left, placed exactly where it should be. Now it was gone, just like the first aid kit. Both items critical. Both taken from inside my pack without any explanation. I didn't confront him. I didn't show that I had realized what was happening. Whatever this was, I had the strong sense that reacting the wrong way could make it worse. So I kept my voice steady, told him everything was fine, and suggested we get some rest. But I didn't sleep at all. Instead, I stayed as quiet as possible, going through my gear piece by piece, checking what else might be missing. But aside from those 2 items, everything else was still there. It wasn't random, it was targeted. At first light, I woke him up and told him we were heading back. I made up an excuse, said I wasn't feeling well, that something I had eaten might have been off. He didn't argue, but there was something in his reaction that stood out, not frustration about the work, but something closer to disappointment, like something had been cut short before it could play out. As we made our way back through the forest, I had to remind him multiple times to use his satellite phone to contact the team and let them know we were returning early. He kept delaying, offering weak excuses, until I finally told him plainly that if he didn't make the call, I would take the phone and do it myself. That was the first time I saw him hesitate, really hesitate, before finally agreeing. The rest of the hike was quiet in a way that felt anything but peaceful. I kept checking over my shoulder, unable to shake the feeling that I needed to stay aware at all times, while he walked behind or beside me, his attention lingering on me in a way that made my skin crawl. We made it back without incident. That same week, I requested a new assistant. I kept it professional, said it was a matter of incompatibility, nothing more, because I knew how it would sound if I tried to explain what I had felt out there. Most people would probably say I was overreacting, that there's no proof anything would have happened. But I know what I felt in that forest, and I know what it means when essential gear starts disappearing without explanation. When someone acts just slightly outside of what you can rationalize. I listened to my instincts, and I got out of there. I'm convinced that if I hadn't, something very, very wrong would have happened out there.
Hi everyone, and welcome to Horror Spectator. If you're new here, consider subscribing. We dive deep into the darkest, most chilling real-life horror stories out there. And if you're a returning viewer, I'm so glad to have you back, friend. Dim the lights, get comfortable, and let's head back into the mountains. And remember, viewer discretion is advised.
I've lived most of my life in Wyoming, out where the land stretches out so far that you can stand still and hear absolutely nothing but the wind. And for as long as I can remember, I've always preferred that kind of silence, because at least out there, when something feels off, you can usually point to it. You can usually say, it's just the wind, it's just an animal, it's just your imagination. But the problem is, I didn't grow up only there, and the other place I spent my childhood in never gave me that kind of clarity. My grandparents lived in West Virginia, deep in the mountains, in this old house that had been in the family for generations. And when I say old, I don't mean charming old. I mean the kind of old where the wood feels tired, where the walls creak even when no one's moving, where every room feels like it remembers something you don't. My parents always encouraged me to spend time there, said it was good for me, that being close to nature would ground me. And honestly, I loved it. I really did. But even as a kid, there was always something about that house that made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. And that feeling was always tied to one place: the attic. It wasn't just that I wasn't allowed up there. It was how strict that rule was. How absolute it felt. It wasn't even up for discussion, and my grandmother enforced it in a way that didn't feel normal. Not like a "don't go up there, you'll get hurt" kind of thing, but more like she was genuinely afraid of what would happen if I did. My grandfather, on the other hand, used to tell me stories about it, always smiling, always acting like it was just for fun. But the stories themselves were never playful. They were creepy. Like they were meant to sound like jokes, but had something underneath them that stuck with me long after he finished talking. And I was a kid. I didn't know how to separate what was real from what wasn't. Especially when everything around me seemed to confirm that something wasn't right. Because the attic was always sealed, always locked, always off limits. And the house itself had secrets. I knew that before I even knew what that meant. There were passages in that place, hidden ones. Small crawl spaces behind walls, narrow doors tucked into corners that didn't make sense. And I found them the way kids always do, by accident at first, and then on purpose, turning it into a game, learning how to move through the house without being seen, popping out in places my grandparents didn't expect, thinking I was clever, thinking it was just something fun I had discovered. The best part was that they never knew I knew. Or at least, I don't think they did. And for a long time, it stayed that way. Just a harmless secret. Something that made me feel like the house belonged to me in a way it didn't belong to anyone else. Until the day I found the passage that led somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. I must have been around 8. Maybe a little younger, and I remember it so clearly because even now, thinking about it, I get that same feeling in my chest. Like something tightening, like my body remembers before my mind does. The passage was narrower than the others, darker too, like it hadn't been used in a long time, and I followed it anyway, because that's what I did. I kept going until I found where it led, and when I reached the end, there was a door, and it wasn't locked. That was the first thing that felt wrong, because every other entrance to the attic was sealed shut. I knew that. I had checked. I had tried. And suddenly, here was this door, a hidden one, untouched, just sitting there like it had been waiting for me. I'll admit, I was scared, but being a kid and not really understanding what danger meant, I was a lot more excited and curious than afraid. So I just opened the door. The second it moved, even just a crack, something hit me. Not physically, not like a gust of air or anything like that, but something deeper, something instinctive. Like every part of me was screaming that I shouldn't be there, that I had just done something I couldn't undo. Even at that age, that's exactly what it felt like to me, that something had latched onto me. I didn't see much in the attic, just glimpses, the edge of the attic. Thick layers of dust, webs stretched across beams. The kind of stillness that only comes from a place that hasn't been disturbed in years. But I know it wasn't empty. I didn't see anything, I just knew I wasn't alone in there. And I panicked. I slammed the door, ran back through the passage, barely even aware of where I was going, just trying to get out, trying to get back somewhere that felt normal, shouting for my grandmother before I even reached her, already crying, already terrified in a way that didn't make sense for what I had actually seen. But her reaction made it worse, because she didn't calm me down. She didn't tell me it was okay. The moment she realized where I had been, what I had opened, she broke like something inside her snapped. I had never seen an adult react like that before. That's when it stopped feeling like a childhood fear and started feeling like something real. Everything after that is fragmented. Obviously, what I'm telling you happened years ago, and because of that, my memory isn't perfect. It's strange because there are parts of it I remember with absolute clarity, like I could just close my eyes and be right back in that dark place, staring at it all over again. But then there are other parts, like what led me to the attic, what happened right after I told my grandmother, that feel fragmented, almost out of reach. There are things I genuinely can't remember, no matter how hard I try. I've even tried hypnosis at one point, and while it helped a little, there's still this barrier in my mind, something that feels like it's actively stopping me from remembering everything as clearly as I want to. I remember the bath, the water hotter than it should have been, the smell of salt, so much salt that it stung my skin, and her hands shaking while she poured it in, muttering things under her breath that I couldn't understand. I remember my grandfather being sent into town, coming back with things I didn't recognize, and then later, a fire outside with objects being burned. Things from the house, I think, though I couldn't tell you what. The next day, there were people there. Men who went straight to that part of the house, sealing the passage, not just locking it, but closing it off completely like it had never been there. And a woman who spoke to me in a language I didn't know, asking me to repeat words that felt heavy in my mouth. And then just gaps. Whole pieces of that time are just missing. But what stayed was the feeling. The feeling that after that, I was never alone again. Especially at night, there was always something. Not something I could see, not something I could hear clearly, but something that was there, watching and waiting, close enough that I could feel it, even when I tried to ignore it. And as I got older, it didn't go away. It just changed, became quieter and heavier, like it settled into me instead of staying around me. I know this probably makes me sound crazy, but I swear that's exactly what it feels like something that was in that attic latched onto me deep inside and never really left. Even in college, miles away and surrounded by people, I'd have moments where I'd feel it again. That same presence, dragging at me, pulling me down, sitting there in the dark while I tried to sleep. And I never told anyone. Because how do you even begin to explain something like that without sounding like you've completely lost it? I tried talking to my grandmother about it years later, when I was older, when I thought maybe she'd finally tell me the truth. But by then, Alzheimer's had already taken most of her. There was one moment, though, where she looked at me like she knew exactly what I was asking, and she told me there had been something in that attic, something old and strong, and that whoever let it out wouldn't ever really be free of it again. In that moment, she was confirming everything I had felt over the years. And I tried to ask her how she knew all of that. But even the way she said those things was scattered, almost disconnected. To anyone else, probably even my mom, it would have sounded like the rambling of someone who had lost touch with reality. But I knew that wasn't the case. I knew she understood exactly what she was saying, even if she couldn't fully put it into words, even if her thoughts came out in fragments. After she told me that, I just sat there with her for a long time, holding her hand, both of us staring out the window without really saying anything else. I couldn't even tell what I was feeling in that moment, whether it was some kind of relief, knowing I wasn't crazy and that there really was something I didn't understand, or something closer to dread, realizing she had just confirmed I might have to live with that feeling for the rest of my life. All I know is that it took a nurse telling me twice that visiting hours were over before I finally got up and left. She died not long after, and my parents didn't want anything to do with the house. They never had. So it ended up with me. Which brings me to the present moment. I haven't been back to the house since, not once. It's been 5 years now, and I've done everything I can to avoid it, to pretend it's just a place, just a house, just something I can ignore, but I can't anymore. Because a few weeks ago, I got a call saying someone broke in, vandalized parts of the house, forced entry, damaged things inside, and now there are documents that need to be signed, things that need to be handled in person, which means I have to go back. And I don't know how to explain this in a way that doesn't sound insane, but the fear I feel about stepping into that house again isn't just about what's there. It's about what's been with me this whole time. Over the years, I learned how to live with it. Like I adapted to its presence just as much as it adapted to mine. But there were periods in my life that were really bad. And what scares me now is the idea of going back to that house and completely losing control. What I'm about to tell you started more than 25 years ago. I'm only telling it now because about a week ago, my son said something that genuinely terrified me. And I'm not someone who scares easily, not anymore at least, but this hit differently. And to be honest, I feel a little lost right now, like I don't really know what I'm supposed to do next. I told my wife about it, and she had the exact same reaction I did, completely freaked out. But the thing is, she didn't go through what I went through as a kid, so for her, it's just unsettling. For me, it's something else entirely. So, I guess I need to go back a bit and explain everything from the beginning, otherwise none of this is going to make sense. I've got a 5-year-old son, and everything I'm about to tell you started about 30 years ago, when I was around his age, maybe a little older. I've lived my whole life in the Appalachian mountains. Never really left, never went to college, and honestly, I don't regret that. I built a life here, learned things on my own, and I'm happy where I am. My wife, on the other hand, she's from Denver. She actually went to college. She's a biologist and studies wildlife out here. And about 7 years ago, she moved here for work. That's when we met, and we decided to stay. It made sense. This place was already my home, and it became hers too. Our house sits at the very end of a dead-end road, so on one side there's a neighbor, but on the other side, and behind us, it's just forest. Thick, endless forest. It's actually pretty similar to the house I grew up in, except that one was even more isolated. My bedroom window back then looked straight into the trees, and now it's the same for me, for my wife, and for my son. So, yeah, this is the kind of place we live in. Quiet, remote, beautiful. But also the kind of place where things can happen without anyone ever knowing. And growing up, I loved it. I really did. But things were different back then. I know 30 years doesn't sound like that long, but out here, it is. Back then, there were a lot more stories going around about the forest. And not just random stories, warnings really. There were people, dangerous people, who used these woods as hunting grounds, kids mostly, and parents, including mine, would tell us all kinds of things to keep us from wandering too far in. Some of those stories stuck with me more than they probably should have. I made a point not to pass those stories down to my son. I didn't want to scare him the way I had been scared. Because the truth is, sometimes those stories mess with you more than they protect you. As I got older, I started realizing most of them were just that. Stories. Exaggerations. Things adults said to keep kids close to home. But there was one story that never really left me, because unlike the others, I had reasons to believe it wasn't just a story. When I was a kid, around 5 or 6, my grandfather told me about a man who had been chained up in the forest by people from the nearby town. They said he was responsible for a series of crimes, but according to the story, he was innocent. He had been made a scapegoat. The real criminals were people with influence, people who needed someone to take the fall so they could keep doing what they were doing without suspicion. So they chained him in the woods and they did terrible things to him. When he was dying, still chained, he swore he would come back for them. Not just them, but their families and friends, their children and their grandchildren. The story went that at night, if a child misbehaved, they would hear the sound of chains dragging through the forest, slow and heavy. If they opened a window or stepped outside, or did anything they weren't supposed to do, that man would come for them. He would wrap them in chains and take them back into the forest with him. I was just a kid, so yeah, it scared the hell out of me. But at the same time, I believed I was a good kid, so I figured I didn't have anything to worry about. That's what kids do, right? They find ways to make themselves feel safe. And for a while, that worked. Until one night, it didn't. I remember it clearly, in a way that doesn't really make sense after all these years. I woke up in the middle of the night, and at first I didn't know why. I just had that feeling, like something had pulled you out of sleep. And then I heard it. Chains dragging across the ground, getting closer and closer. I must have been around 8 at that point, maybe a little older, but I remember exactly how it felt. My whole body went stiff, like I couldn't even move, like if I stayed still enough, maybe it wouldn't notice me. My room was full of stuffed toys back then. And that night, I remember stacking them around me, building this little wall, like somehow that was going to protect me from whatever was outside. I stayed there, barely breathing, listening to those chains scraping against the ground, getting closer and closer. And even now, I can still hear it if I think about it too hard. I think that was the first time I ever felt real fear. Not the kind you laugh off, but the kind that makes you feel sick. And I did get sick. For a couple of days after that, I was throwing up, couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly, just completely messed up. And then on the third night, I heard it again. At that point, something in me just snapped a little. Earlier that day, some kids had been messing with me, saying I needed to be braver, that I needed to stand up for myself. And I don't know why, but that stuck with me. So, even though I was absolutely terrified, I got out of bed. I remember moving so slowly, like every step felt loud, even though I was trying not to make a sound, and I walked up to the window. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears. Then I looked outside, and he was there, out by the trees, just at the edge where the yard meets the forest. There was a figure, dragging chains behind him. I couldn't see his face properly. It was too dark. But I could see the way he moved, slow, like he wasn't in any rush because he knew exactly where he was going. I don't even remember deciding to scream. It just happened. I ran out of my room, down the hallway, yelling for my parents, completely out of control. My mom took me seriously right away. She let me sleep in their room, stayed with me, tried to calm me down. And over the next few days, they tried to figure out what had happened, whether I had really seen someone or if it was just my imagination. She even argued with my grandfather, told him he shouldn't be telling stories like that to a kid my age. And then it just stopped. I never heard the chains again after that. Weeks went by, then months, and eventually I convinced myself it hadn't been real. That I'd scared myself, that my brain filled in the gaps, like kids do. I grew up, moved on, and carried on with my life. The fear never completely went away, especially at night, but it became something distant, something I could manage. Until last week, when my son came into our room in the middle of the night, crying, shaking, saying the man with the chains was outside and that he was coming to get him. And I swear to you, in that moment, it felt like something inside me just dropped. Like all those years between then and now disappeared, and I was 8 years old again, standing at that window. I held him, told him it wasn't real, that he was safe, that he could stay with us, and he eventually calmed down. But the next day, me and my wife sat him down, tried to understand where this was coming from. We asked if anyone at school had told him a story, if someone had scared him, if he'd heard it anywhere. He said no. He said he just saw him out by the trees. I went to the school and tried to find out whether the teachers knew about any story that might be going around among the kids. I asked other parents if the children seemed scared, or if anyone had heard or sensed that their child knew something. But nothing. Some parents, I felt, got uneasy when I brought it up. I could sense their own childhood fears resurfacing. But they said their children were fine, sleeping alone in their rooms and not having nightmares. And that's the part I can't shake. Because I never told him that story. My parents definitely didn't. My wife had never even heard it before I told her. So there's no reason, no logical reason, for him to describe the exact same thing I saw when I was a kid. I reported it, just in case, because there's always the possibility that this is something real in a different way, that maybe someone's out there using that story to scare people, to get close to kids, to do something worse. And honestly, that possibility terrifies me too. But if I'm being completely honest, what scares me more is the other option, that it's not a person, that whatever I saw back then didn't just disappear. Since that night, my son hasn't slept alone. And sometimes, in the middle of the night, I get up quietly and walk to his room, just to look out the window. But I've never seen anything. No, my son isn't making this up. And I know what I saw all those years ago. So, yeah, I don't really know what's out there. I don't know if it's something I can fight, or something I can explain, or something I can protect him from. All I know is, I'm a grown man, and I'm genuinely afraid of what might be standing just beyond those trees, waiting for one of us to look a little too closely.